Elena Vance sat on a discarded plastic milk crate outside the All-American Gate of Fort Liberty at 0415 on a humid Tuesday morning, watching the condensation bead on the surface of an unopened can of lukewarm Pepsi she had found in a trash bin behind a gas station on Murchison Road. To the thousands of soldiers and civilian contractors beginning their morning commute onto the world's largest military installation, she was a ghost in a field of high-visibility uniforms. A tangle of matted gray-streaked hair, a faded olive-drab poncho liner draped over her shoulders like a shroud, and a pair of boots so worn the leather looked like petrified wood. Her cardboard sign, leaning against her shins, didn't actually say veteran or God bless, because Elena knew that in Fayetteville, North Carolina, those words were a currency so devalued they wouldn't even buy her the silence she needed to hear the frequency shifting in the air. She didn't want their money, and she certainly didn't want their pity. She wanted the 3-second window of time when the gate's automated scanners performed their handshake with the encrypted transponders of the incoming vehicles. The humidity in the Carolina pines was a physical weight, the kind that turned a clean uniform into a damp rag within minutes. Elena felt it differently. She felt it as a medium for the radio waves and the low-frequency hum of the bass waking up. Most people saw the All-American Gate as a bottleneck of concrete and steel, a place of frustration and ID checks. Elena saw it as a sieve. She sat exactly 32 feet from the primary sensor array, a position she had chosen because it was the precise dead zone where the security camera's infrared bleed didn't wash out the small, modified handheld receiver she kept tucked into the lining of her poncho. The receiver wasn't much bigger than a deck of cards, a custom-built piece of kit she'd soldered together from salvaged components in a motel room that smelled like cigarettes and desperation, but it was sensitive enough to catch the ghosts in the machine. A black Chevy Tahoe with government plates and tinted windows slowed as it approached the barrier. Elena didn't look up, but her thumb moved almost imperceptibly, clicking a small button on the side of her receiver. The Tahoe was a standard issue for the higher-ranking staff or the JSOC boys, but this one was different. Elena didn't need to see the driver to know. She had timed this specific vehicle for the last 4 days. It entered at 0422, never 0421 or 0423. In the military, punctuality was a virtue, but in Elena's world, that kind of precision was a signature. As the Tahoe's transponder pinged the gate's receiver, Elena's handheld device vibrated once against her ribs. It was a sharp, discordant pulse. The Tahoe's encrypted handshake was carrying a secondary burst, a subcarrier frequency that was bleeding data back out into the civilian world. She took a slow sip of the Pepsi, the sugar hitting her tongue with a chemical metallic tang. Her mind, trained in the deep, windowless vaults of the National Security Agency and the forward operating bases of the Hindu Kush, automatically began to deconstruct the burst. It wasn't a standard signal. It was a parasite. Someone was using the base's own security gate to exfiltrate data from the secure network, using the vehicles as mules. It was brilliant, quiet, and completely invisible to the young MPs standing guard with their M4s and their tired eyes. A young specialist named Miller, whose name tape was perfectly centered and whose boots were still shiny from the PX, walked toward the perimeter fence where Elena sat. He carried a brown paper bag and a look of practiced, slightly uncomfortable compassion. Elena watched him through the veil of her hair. She knew his type. From a small town in Ohio, probably, joined for the GI Bill, still believed the world was divided into people who needed help and people who gave it. He didn't see the woman who had spent 16 years hunting shadows in the electromagnetic spectrum. He saw a problem that needed a Band-Aid. "Morning, ma'am," Miller said, his voice cracking slightly in the damp air. He held out the bag. "I brought you a breakfast sandwich from the Chapette. And some water. It's going to be a scorcher today. You really shouldn't be sitting so close to the gate. Sergeant of the Guard is starting to get twitchy about the visual for the morning rush." Elena didn't move. She didn't reach for the bag. She just stared at the mud on his boots. "The sensor on lane 3 is misaligned by 4 degrees, she said, her voice raspy from days of silence and the grit of the roadside. "The scan is taking 1-2 seconds longer than it should. You're creating a lag in the buffer." Miller blinked, the compassion flickering into confusion. "What, ma'am, I'm just trying to give you some food. You can't be here. If the provost marshal sees you, they're gonna have us trespass you, and I don't want to do that. Just take the sandwich and maybe move down toward the gas station." Elena looked up then, her eyes a startling, piercing blue that didn't match the ruin of her outward appearance. For a second, Miller froze. He saw something in those eyes that didn't belong to a vagrant. It was the look of a senior NCO who was about to smoke a private into the dirt for a lapse in discipline. It was a look of absolute, terrifying competence. "Your sidearm is dirty, Specialist," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the rasp and gaining a hard, serrated edge. "The carbon buildup on the slide indicates you haven't cleaned it since your last range day. If you had to pull that trigger in a hurry, you'd have a failure to feed on the second round. Is that how you want to start your Tuesday?" Miller took a half-step back, his hand instinctively fluttering toward his holster. "How? How do you know when I was at the range?" "I can smell the CLP and the burnt cordite from here," Elena lied. She didn't smell it. She had simply watched the way he handled the weapon, the slight stiffness in the holster, the way he favored his right side. She knew the mechanics of the soldier because she had been the one to build them. "Take your sandwich, Miller. I don't want it. And tell your sergeant of the guard that if he wants me moved, he should come do it himself instead of sending a boy to do a man's job." Miller stood there for a long moment, the paper bag trembling slightly. He looked at the woman on the crate, then at the gate, then back at her. The visual of her was exactly what the Army hated, a reminder of what could happen when the machine was finished with a human being. But the way she spoke, the cadence of her command, it was like a ghost signal from a frequency he wasn't cleared to hear. He turned and walked back to the guard shack, his pace faster than it had been, the breakfast sandwich still clutched in his hand. Elena watched him go, then turned her attention back to the Tahoe, which had long since disappeared into the heart of the base. She reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a small, battered notebook. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, times, license plates, frequencies, and signal strengths. It was a map of a conspiracy, drawn in the shorthand of a woman who had been erased from the official record. Elena Vance had grown up in Bluefield, West Virginia, a town where the mountains were both a sanctuary and a cage. Her father had been a coal miner who spent his nights hunched over a ham radio in the basement, chasing signals from as far away as Vladivostok and Tokyo. He had taught Elena that the air wasn't empty, it was a conversation. By the time she was 12, she could identify a Soviet submarine broadcast by the specific warble of its encryption. When the recruiters came to her high school, they didn't see a girl from a holler. They saw a linguistic and technical prodigy who could see the spectrum the way a musician sees a score. The Army had been her home, her family, and her religion for nearly 2 decades. She had risen through the ranks of the Intelligence and Security Command, becoming one of the few women to operate within the gray space, the blurred line between tactical signals intelligence and strategic cyber warfare. She was the one they sent in when the satellites couldn't see through the cloud cover or when the local encryption was too dense for the analysts in Fort Meade to crack. She was a master sergeant who didn't exist on most rosters, a woman who had spent more time in the back of a C-130 or a windowless van in a dusty alleyway in Kandahar than she ever had in a parade formation. The homeless persona wasn't just a disguise, it was a consequence. 3 years ago, while stationed at the NSA's regional center in Georgia, Elena had flagged a series of anomalies in the procurement of high-end encryption hardware. It was a boring, procedural detail, a mismatch in serial numbers, but to Elena it was a discordant note in a symphony. She had followed the thread, expecting to find a contractor skimming off the top. Instead, she had found a backdoor being built into the very hardware that protected the military's most sensitive communications. She had reported it. She had followed the chain of command, and the chain of command had snapped and whipped back to lash her. Within 48 hours, her clearances were suspended. Within a week, her service record was flagged with a series of psychological instabilities that she couldn't explain. They didn't court-martial her, they just dismantled her. They took her rank, they took her pension, and they took her identity, citing a mental health crisis that they claimed made her a security risk. They had pushed her out the gate of Fort Gordon with nothing but a duffel bag and a non-disclosure agreement that felt like a noose. But they had forgotten one thing. Elena Vance didn't need a clearance to see the spectrum. She didn't need a uniform to be a soldier, and she certainly didn't need their permission to protect the mission. She had spent the last 2 years drifting, a ghost haunting the edges of the military-industrial complex. She had seen the same pattern in San Antonio, in Colorado Springs, and now here at the epicenter of the Army's power. Fort Liberty. The anomalies were getting louder. The ghosts in the gate scanners weren't just leaks, they were a countdown. The sun began to crest the tops of the longleaf pines, casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt. The morning rush was in full swing now. Thousands of cars, a river of steel and glass flowing into the base. Elena sat unmoved, a rock in the middle of the stream. She noticed a black SUV, a different one this time, parked in the lot of a dilapidated strip mall across the street. It was a nondescript Ford Explorer, the kind used by local law enforcement or private security. Two men sat inside. They were pretending to drink coffee, but their eyes were fixed on the All-American gate. Specifically, they were fixed on the milk crate 32 feet from the sensor array. Elena didn't need her receiver to know they were watching her. She felt the weight of their gaze like a physical pressure on the back of her neck. They were clean-cut, thick-necked men with the telltale operator tan and the posture of people who were used to being the predators. They weren't MPs. They weren't local cops. They were the cleanup crew. She reached down and adjusted her boots, the movement hiding the fact that she was activating the second device in her pocket, a small, high-powered jammer. It wouldn't stop their radios, but it would create a flicker in any digital recording they were making of her. If they wanted a picture of her face, they were going to get a pixelated mess. "You're a long way from Bluefield, Elena," she whispered to herself, the sound lost in the roar of a passing convoy of Humvees. She felt the old familiar tension coiling in her gut, the pre-mission jitters that she hadn't felt since the night before a jump into the core angle. It was a cold, sharp feeling, a clarity that stripped away the hunger and the exhaustion and the bone-deep ache of sleeping on concrete. She was back in the gray space. At 0800, a silver Lexus approached the gate. It was a civilian vehicle, but it had a distinguished visitor sticker on the windshield. The driver was a woman in her 50s, sharp-featured, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than Elena's last 3 months of income. This was Dr. Eris Thorne, a high-level civilian consultant for the Department of the Army and, more importantly, the wife of Lieutenant General Marcus Thorne, the Deputy Commanding General of the Roman 18 Airborne Corps. Elena watched the Lexus slow down. Her receiver didn't vibrate. The Lexus was clean. But as the car passed the sensor, Elena noticed a small, black object attached to the underside of the rear bumper. It was no bigger than a matchbox. To anyone else, it would look like a piece of road debris or a magnetic key holder. To Elena, it was a transponder, a beacon designed to trigger a specific response from the gate system. As the Lexus cleared the barrier, the entire gate system hesitated. The lights on the sensor array flickered from green to amber and back to green. It was a half-second glitch. A burp in the data stream. But in that half-second, Elena's receiver caught a massive upload. It wasn't a leak this time. It was a command. Something had just been told to wake up inside the base's secure network. Elena stood up, her joints popping like dry kindling. She didn't look at the SUV across the street. She didn't look at the MPs. She picked up her cardboard sign, folded her poncho liner with a precise military fold that would have made a drill sergeant proud, and began to walk. She didn't walk away from the gate. She walked toward the pedestrian entrance, the small, turnstile-style gate used by joggers and people who lived in the nearby housing. She knew the protocol. An unidentified vagrant approaching the pedestrian gate would trigger a contact from the MPs. It would get her noticed. It would get her brought into an interrogation room. And an interrogation room was exactly where she needed to be. Because inside that room, there would be a networked computer. And Elena Vance only needed 30 seconds of physical access to a terminal to prove that the All-American gate was being used to bleed the United States Army dry. But as she reached the turnstile, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. It wasn't the tentative hand of Specialist Miller. It was a heavy iron grip that brooked no argument. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," a voice said. It was low, flat, and devoid of any American regional accent, the voice of a professional who had been trained to disappear. Elena turned. It was one of the men from the Ford Explorer. Close up, he smelled of peppermint and gun oil. He had a small earpiece curled into his right ear. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but the way he stood, his feet shoulder-width apart, his weight on the balls of his feet, told her everything she needed to know. "I'm just going for a walk," Elena said, her voice returning to its raspy, homeless register. "It's a free country, isn't it, officer?" "You're trespassing on federal property," the man said, his grip tightening. He didn't look at her face, he looked at her hands. He was looking for a weapon. He didn't see the receiver hidden in her sleeve. "We've had complaints. You're a security hazard." I'm a veteran, Elena said, leaning into the lie that was also a truth. I have a right to be here. You have a right to a jail cell, the man said. He began to steer her toward the Ford Explorer, which had pulled up to the curb. Let's go, quietly. Elena didn't resist. She let herself be led. As she was pushed into the back seat of the SUV, she saw Specialist Miller watching from the guard shack. He looked worried. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he was just a kid in a uniform, and the men in the black SUV were something else entirely. Inside the SUV, the air conditioning was a sudden, violent cold. The second man was driving. He didn't look back. Search her, the driver said. The man next to Elena began to go through her pockets. He found the Pepsi can. He found the notebook. He found the cardboard sign. But when he reached for the lining of her poncho, Elena didn't wait. She didn't use a punch. She used a focused, two-finger strike to the nerve cluster in his wrist, the brachial stun she had learned in a survival course in Okinawa. The man's hand went numb instantly, his fingers splaying out like a dead spider. Before he could react, Elena slammed her forehead into his nose. There was a sickening asterisk crunch asterisk, and a spray of blood hit the back of the front seat. The driver swore and reached for his sidearm, but the SUV was moving, and they were in the middle of the morning traffic on Bragg Boulevard. He couldn't draw and drive at the same time. Elena grabbed the man she had just hit, using his own weight to pin him against the door. She reached into his waistband and pulled out his radio, a high-end encrypted Motorola. This is Master Sergeant Elena Vance, service number 7-2-9-4-1-1-0, she said into the radio, her voice cold and clear as mountain water. She didn't use the emergency channel. She used the command override frequency she had decoded 2 days ago. I am in a black Ford Explorer, North Carolina plate Delta Sierra 904. I am being abducted by unidentified contractors. I have eyes on a level 1 security breach at the All-American Gate. If you want to stop the exfiltration of the Roman 18 core tactical data, you will intercept this vehicle before it hits the I-295 interchange. She didn't wait for a reply. She jammed the radio into the driver's neck, the hard plastic edge cutting into his jugular. Slow down, she commanded the driver, or we find out how fast this airbag deploys. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden primal fear. He didn't see a homeless woman anymore. He saw a predator. He saw the woman who had spent 16 years in the gray space, and he realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. But the ghost in the system was faster than a radio call. As the SUV slowed, a black Tahoe, the same one Elena had seen earlier, swerved out of the traffic and slammed into their rear quarter panel. The impact sent the Explorer spinning across the asphalt. Glass shattered. The world turned upside down. Elena felt the impact in her teeth, a jarring, bone-shaking jolt. She tasted copper. She felt the warmth of her own blood. But as the SUV came to a rest on its side in the ditch, she didn't stop. She kicked out the shattered windshield and crawled through the glass, her fingers clawing at the dirt. She was 10 feet from the perimeter fence of Fort Liberty. Behind her, the men from the Tahoe were already out of their vehicle. They didn't have badges. They had suppressed submachine guns. They weren't there to arrest her. They were there to delete her. Elena looked at the fence. It was 10 feet of chain link topped with concertina wire. On the other side was the base. On this side was her death. She didn't run for the fence. She ran for the gate. She ran toward the line of cars, toward the MPs, toward the only place where she might be seen. She was a blur of olive drab and gray hair, screaming not for help but for a code red. "Lock it down," she yelled, her voice tearing through the humid air. "Gate is compromised, code red, code red." Specialist Miller saw her first. He saw the woman he had given a sandwich to, running through the traffic with blood on her face and a look of absolute, terrifying purpose. He saw the men with the submachine guns behind her. He didn't think. He didn't wait for an order. He raised his M4 and fired a burst into the air. "Contact!" he screamed. "Contact at the gate!" The world exploded into motion. The hydraulic barriers at the gate slammed upward with a roar of metal. The MPs dived for cover. The ghost in the system had been forced into the light. Elena hit the pavement as a hail of bullets from the suppressed weapons chewed up the asphalt where she had been standing a second before. She rolled behind the tire of a stopped minivan, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at her receiver. It was smashed, the screen a spiderweb of cracks, but the wake-up command had already been sent. In the distance, she heard the screaming of sirens, not the police, the base's emergency response teams, and then she saw it. A motorcade was approaching from the inside of the base, heading toward the gate. 4 black Suburbans flanked by military police motorcycles. The flags on the fenders were small, but they were unmistakable. 3 stars. Lieutenant General Marcus Thorne. The men who had been chasing Elena froze. They looked at the motorcade, then at each other. They knew they couldn't win a gunfight with a general's security detail. They turned and vanished back into the traffic, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Elena stayed on the ground. She didn't move. She lay in the oil and the grit of the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her poncho was torn, her hands were bleeding, and she looked like exactly what they called her, a homeless veteran sleeping by the gate. The motorcade screeched to a halt. MPs flooded the area, weapons drawn, shouting orders. Specialist Miller was pointing toward the ditch, his face pale. "She's over there," he shouted. "She's the one who called it." A tall, silver-haired man stepped out of the lead Suburban. He wore a set of multicam fatigues with 3 stars pinned to the chest. His face was a map of old wars and hard decisions. This was Marcus Thorne. He looked at the chaos at the gate, the shattered SUV in the ditch, and the woman lying in the dirt behind the minivan. He walked toward her, his security detail struggling to keep up. The MPs tried to block him. "Sir, it's not secure," a major shouted. "Get back in the vehicle." Thorne ignored him. He walked straight to where Elena lay. He looked down at her, at the gray hair, the blood, the tattered poncho, and the broken receiver clutched in her hand. For a long moment the world went silent. The sirens, the shouting, the idling engines, it all faded into the background. Elena looked up at him. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She just held his gaze with those piercing blue eyes. She didn't see a general. She saw a man who had been a captain when she was a private, a man who knew exactly what the gray space was. "The sensor on lane 3, Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're using the transponders, Marcus. They're bleeding the tactical net. I tried to tell them." The general's face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. He looked at the shattered receiver in her hand. He looked at the visual of her. The ruin of a career he knew had been a masterpiece of service. Then he did something that made every MP, every civilian, and every soldier at the All-American Gate freeze in place. Lieutenant General Marcus Thorne, the deputy commanding general of the Roman 18 Airborne Corps, snapped his heels together. He brought his right hand up to his brow in a crisp, perfect salute. He didn't salute the MPs. He didn't salute the flags on his car. He saluted the woman in the dirt. "Master Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice carrying through the silence like a thunderclap. "I believe you have a report for me." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the realization that the world wasn't what it seemed. The homeless woman wasn't a problem to be moved. She was the only person in the room who knew they were already at war. Elena didn't return the salute. She couldn't. Her arm wouldn't move, but she did something else. She reached into the tattered lining of her poncho and pulled out the small, blood-stained notebook. She held it out to him, her hand steady despite the tremors in her body. "It's all in here, sir," she said. "The frequencies, the times, the names of the contractors, they are inside the wire. They've been inside the wire for months." Thorne took the notebook. He didn't hand it to an aide. He tucked it into his own pocket. "Get her to the hospital," Thorne commanded, looking at the major. "Not the civilian one, Womack, under my personal authority, level 1 security. No one talks to her except me. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," the major stammered, his eyes darting between the general and the woman. "But, sir, who is she?" Thorne looked at Elena one last time as the medics began to lift her onto a stretcher. "She's the reason you're still standing on a secure base, Major," Thorne said. "And if we're lucky, she's the reason we might actually win this thing." As the ambulance doors closed, Elena Vance felt the tension finally break. She felt the cold rage that had sustained her for 3 years begin to cool into something else, a dark, quiet competence that was ready for the next phase. She knew the general's salute wasn't an ending. It was a declaration of war. The ghosts were still in the machine. The Black Tahoe was still out there, and the command that had been sent to the secure network was already propagating. Elena closed her eyes as the morphine the medics had administered began to take hold. She didn't think about the pain. She didn't think about the hunger. She thought about the signal. She had been right. She had always been right. And now, for the first time in 3 years, someone was finally listening. But as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Elena's hand tightened on the one thing she hadn't given the general, a small encrypted USB drive she had pulled from the man in the Explorer during the struggle. The notebook had the how. The drive had the who, and she wasn't ready to give that up yet, not until she knew who she could trust, because in the gray space, a salute was just a gesture. A bullet was a conversation. And Elena Vance still had a lot to say. The hospital room at Womack Army Medical Center was a sterile white box, but to Elena, it felt like a prison. They had scrubbed the homeless away, replaced her poncho with a thin blue gown and her boots with non-slip socks. They had stitched the gash on her forehead and pumped her full of fluids, but they couldn't wash away the vibration she felt in her teeth, the lingering resonance of the wake-up command. She lay still, her eyes tracking the movement of the MP standing guard outside the glass door. He was a sergeant older than Miller with a tab on his shoulder and a look of intense boredom. He thought he was guarding a patient. He didn't realize he was a secondary layer of a breach. Elena looked at the heart monitor next to her bed. She watched the green lines spike and dip. She knew how to manipulate it. She had learned it in SEER school, how to control her heart rate to signal to a teammate or to fool a polygraph. She began to breathe in a specific rhythm, 4 seconds in, 2 seconds hold, 6 seconds out. The green line began to smooth. She needed to get to a terminal. The USB drive was hidden in the one place they hadn't looked, taped to the inside of the thick bandage on her thigh where they had treated a deep abrasion from the glass. The door opened. It wasn't the general. It was a man in a lab coat followed by 2 men in suits. They didn't look like doctors. They had the Beltway look, expensive haircuts and eyes that saw everything as a liability. "Miss Vance," the man in the lab coat said, looking at a clipboard. "I'm Dr. Sterling. These gentlemen are from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. They have some questions about the incident at the gate." Elena didn't look at them. She looked at the ceiling. "Where is General Thorne?" "The general is in a briefing," one of the suits said. His voice was smooth, like oil on a calm sea. "He's very concerned about your well-being, but we need to verify some of the information you gave him. You mentioned a level 1 security breach. That's a very serious allegation, Elena, especially for someone with your history." Elena turned her head slowly. She looked at the suit. "My history is the reason I'm the only one who saw it. And if you're from DCSA, you already know that my history was a fabrication used to cover a procurement scandal in 2021. So let's skip the part where you pretend I'm crazy and move to the part where you tell me why the gate sensors are still running the parasite protocol." The 2 suits exchanged a glance. The smooth one leaned in closer. "We've checked the sensors, Elena. They're clean." The technicians found a minor software glitch, likely caused by the humidity. "There is no parasite protocol. There is no data exfiltration." Elena felt the cold rage flare up in her chest. It wasn't explosive. It was a slow, steady heat, like a coal fire. A software glitch doesn't send a command override to the JSOC server farm at 0805. A software glitch doesn't trigger a wake-up signal on a consultant's vehicle. "We've spoken to Dr. Thorne," the suit said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Her vehicle was inspected. It was clean. You were hallucinating, Elena. The stress of your situation, the heat. It's understandable. We want to help you. We want to get you into a facility where you can get the care you need." Elena looked at the man's tie. It was a silk power tie, a deep burgundy. She noticed a small silver pin on his lapel, a stylized eagle. It wasn't a standard agency pin. It was a private one, a contractor's mark. She realized then that the breach didn't stop at the gate. It was in the room. "I see," Elena said, her voice turning soft, yielding. "Maybe you're right. I haven't slept much. I thought I saw it." "It's okay," the suit said, smiling. It was a practiced, empty smile. "Just tell us where the notebook is. The general said he lost it in the confusion. We need to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The general hadn't lost the notebook. He had it in his pocket. These men weren't from DCSA, or if they were, they weren't working for the government. "The notebook is in the ditch," Elena lied. "I dropped it when the Tahoe hit us. I think it got buried in the mud." The suit's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. "We'll send a team to look for it. In the meantime, the doctor is going to give you something to help you rest." The man in the lab coat stepped forward with a syringe. Elena didn't wait. She reached up and grabbed the heart monitor lead, yanking it hard. The alarm began to scream, a shrill, rhythmic, flatline tone. The MP at the door turned, his hand on his holster. In that second of distraction, Elena swung her legs out of the bed. She didn't go for the suit. She went for the doctor. She grabbed his arm, twisted it, and jammed the syringe into the suit's neck. The man in the burgundy tie gasped, his hands flying to his throat. He stumbled back, his eyes rolling into his head as the sedative, whatever it was, hit his bloodstream. The second suit reached for a weapon under his jacket, but Elena was already moving. She was a blur of blue hospital gown and raw, focused intent. She used the doctor as a shield, shoving him into the second suit, then dived for the floor as the MP burst into the room. "Get down!" the MP shouted. Elena didn't get down. She rolled under the bed, her fingers clawing at the underside of the frame. She had seen the emergency call button earlier. She didn't press it. She ripped the wiring out, creating a short circuit that sent a spark jumping to the metal frame. The room's lights flickered and died as the localized breaker tripped. In the sudden darkness, the MP hesitated. The second suit fired a shot, the suppressed thud of the weapon punching a hole in the mattress above Elena's head. Elena crawled out from under the bed on the opposite side. She didn't run for the door. She ran for the window. They were on the third floor. There was a ledge, a narrow strip of concrete used for window washing. She smashed the glass with a heavy plastic pitcher of water, the sound lost in the screaming of the flatline alarm. She climbed out onto the ledge just as the backup lights flickered on. The MP was standing over the unconscious suit, looking confused. The second suit was pointing his gun at the window. Elena didn't look back. She pressed her back against the brick, the rough surface scraping her skin. The wind was picking up, smelling of rain and jet fuel. She looked down. 30 feet below was the roof of the loading dock. "Master Sergeant." A voice boomed from the ground. She looked down. A black Suburban was idling in the parking lot. General Thorne was standing next to it, his face tilted up toward her. He wasn't alone. He had a squad of rangers with him, men in full kit, weapons held at the low ready. "Jump, Elena," Thorne shouted. "We've got you." Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the odds. She trusted the man who had saluted her in the dirt. She pushed off the ledge, her blue gown fluttering like a broken wing. She hit the roof of the loading dock with a bone-jarring thud, rolling to absorb the impact. She felt a sharp pain in her ankle, but she didn't stop. She slid off the edge of the roof and into the waiting arms of 2 rangers. Thorne was at her side in a second. He threw a heavy tactical jacket over her shoulders. "The notebook," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "The men in the room. They aren't who they say they are." "I know," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "We just pulled the logs from the gate. You were right about the wake-up signal, Elena. It wasn't a command to the JSOC servers. It was a command to the base's automated weapon systems." Elena froze. "The C-rams?" "And the drone arrays," Thorne said, his face grim. "Someone just took control of the entire perimeter defense of Fort Liberty, and they've pointed the guns inward." Elena looked at the general. She felt the weight of the USB drive against her thigh. The threat wasn't a leak. It wasn't a theft. It was a siege, and they were already inside the walls. "The drive," Elena whispered, reaching for the bandage on her leg. "I have the who, Marcus. I have the source code." Thorne looked at the hospital building, where the second suit was now leaning out of the smashed window, his weapon raised. "Get her in the car," Thorne shouted. "Move, move, move." As the Suburban tore out of the parking lot, the sky over Fort Liberty turned a bruised, angry purple. The first of the base's automated sirens began to wail, not the all-clear, but the incoming alarm. Elena Vance sat in the back of the armored vehicle, her hands shaking, her heart hammering. She looked at the general, then at the rangers. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer a vagrant. She was the mission. And the mission was just beginning. The Suburban's heavy-duty suspension groaned as it surged over the curb, the tires screaming against the asphalt of the Womack parking lot. Elena felt the centrifugal force pin her against the leather seat. Her torn hospital gown, a thin, cold mockery against the tactical upholstery. Outside the reinforced glass, the world was a blur of gray concrete and the strobing lights of emergency vehicles. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil, stale coffee, and the general's quiet, simmering fury. The ranger to her left, a man whose name tape read *Rodriguez*, didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the window, his short-barreled carbine held with a casual, terrifying familiarity. He was a professional, and in his world, a woman in a shredded gown leaping from a third-story window was just another variable in a high-stakes extraction. Thorne was on the radio before the vehicle cleared the hospital's perimeter. His voice was a low, controlled rumble, the kind that had directed battalions through the Valley of the Shadow. "This is Voodoo 16 to Liberty Control. I have an unauthorized activation of the perimeter defense grid. Report status of the CRAM arrays on Sector 4 and 5. Now." The response over the encrypted channel was a mess of static and panicked voices. "Sir, we're seeing a localized override. The automated systems are locked in inward engagement mode. We can't cycle the power on the towers. It's like the OS is rewriting itself faster than we can hit the kill switch." Don't hit the kill switch, Thorne snapped. Pull the physical bus bars. Send a team to the transformer substations. If you can't stop the software, kill the heart. He cut the connection and turned to Elena. The interior of the Suburban was dimly lit by the glow of tactical tablets and the dying light of a North Carolina afternoon. He looked at her not as a patient, and not as a ghost, but as the master sergeant who had once decrypted a Taliban insurgent's burst transmission while her own Humvee was upside down in a ditch. "The drive, Elena," he said. "Give it to me." Elena didn't move. She felt the weight of the USB drive against her thigh, the adhesive of the bandage pulling at her skin. She looked at the ranger, then back at the general. "With all due respect, sir, I saw the men in that room. They had agency credentials that were too perfect. They knew about the procurement scandal in 2021. This isn't just a hack. It's a coup from within the civilian oversight. If I give you this drive, it goes into a system that is currently trying to kill us. I need a closed loop. I need a terminal that hasn't touched the base network in 48 hours. Thorne stared at her, his jaw set. He was a man who lived by the chain of command, a man who believed in the sanctity of the institution. But he also knew that the institution was currently pointing a 20mm rotary cannon at his vehicle. "Rodriguez," Thorne said, never taking his eyes off Elena. "Tell the lead vehicle to divert to the annex. The old signals shack behind the jump towers. It's been slated for demolition since the move to the new TOC. It's on a legacy copper wire grid. No fiber, no wireless, no cloud." "Sir," Rodriguez said, already tapping the command into his comm link. The Suburban veered off the main road, taking a sharp turn onto a gravel track that cut through the dense longleaf pines. The trees here were old, their branches draped with Spanish moss that looked like tattered battle flags in the twilight. This was the part of Fort Liberty that the visitors never saw, the rusting remnants of a Cold War infrastructure that had been forgotten in the rush toward a digital future. The signals shack was a squat, windowless cinder block building overgrown with ivy. It looked like a tomb. As the motorcade pulled up, the Rangers spilled out in a choreographed explosion of movement, securing the perimeter with a silence that was more intimidating than a shout. Thorne stepped out and reached back, offering a hand to Elena. She ignored it. She slid out of the vehicle, her bare feet hitting the gravel, the pain in her ankle a sharp, electric reminder that she was still human. She limped toward the heavy steel door of the shack, the tactical jacket Thorne had given her trailing on the ground like a cape. Inside, the shack smelled of dust, dry rot, and the ghost of ozone. It was filled with racks of outdated equipment, oscilloscopes with round green screens, massive tape drives, and rows of manual patch panels. In the corner, sitting on a laminate desk that had seen better decades, was a ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook. It was a relic, thick as a brick and probably half as fast as a modern smartphone, but it was exactly what Elena needed. A young corporal was already there, hunched over the laptop. She had a headset pushed back over a messy bun of dark hair, and her eyes were fixed on a scrolling waterfall of green text. This was Corporal Sarah Huck Huckabee. Elena had heard the name. Huck was the kind of soldier the Army didn't know what to do with, a brilliant coder who had a habit of correcting her instructors, and a file full of Article 15s for unauthorized network exploration. Huck looked up as Elena entered. She didn't look at the hospital gown or the blood. She looked at Elena's eyes, and then she looked at the bandage on her leg. "You're the ghost," Huck said, her voice a flat Midwestern drawl. "The one who flagged the transponders at the All-American. I've been looking at your old files, Master Sergeant. Your logic gates are unconventional. I like them." "Less talk, Corporal," Thorne said, stepping into the room. "Can you isolate the drive? I've got an air-gapped kernel running on a Linux build from 2012, Huck said, patting the Toughbook. "It's too stupid to be hacked by whatever is running through the base grid. It doesn't even have a wireless card. If you want to talk to it, you have to use a cable." Elena sat down in a creaky metal chair, her breath hitching. She reached down and peeled back the bandage on her thigh. The USB drive was small, black, and smeared with a thin film of her own blood. She handed it to Huck. "The man I took this from," Elena said. "He was professional. He didn't flinch when I hit him. He was waiting for me. They knew I'd be at the gate. They knew I'd see the signal. They wanted me to find it, Marcus. They wanted me to lead them to you." Thorne frowned. "Why?" "Because you're the only one who can authorize the final override for the regional defense grid," Elena said, her voice growing cold. "The automated guns are pointing inward, but they can't fire on high-value targets without a command signature. Your signature." Huck slid the drive into the port. The Toughbook whirred, its cooling fan sounding like a miniature jet engine. A window popped up on the screen, filled with folders that were encrypted with a 256-bit AES key. "I can't crack this with this hardware," Huck said, her fingers dancing across the keys. "It'll take a decade to brute force it." "You don't need to brute force it," Elena said. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the file names. "Look at the naming convention. It's not military, it's corporate. See the AP prefix? That's Apex Protocols. It's a private security firm out of Northern Virginia. They handled the software integration for the new gate sensors." "Apex," Thorne whispered. "They are one of the primary contractors for the Roman 18 core modernization project." "The password won't be a word," Elena said. "It'll be a frequency." Huck opened the audio terminal. "Run the subcarrier signal I recorded from the Tahoe this morning. The 440 hertz bleed." Huck complied, her brow furrowed in concentration. As the rhythmic pulse of the recorded signal echoed through the small shack, Elena began to type. She wasn't typing letters, she was typing the numerical values of the signal's wavelength. The screen flickered. The folders opened. Huck let out a low whistle. "Holy mother of, sir, you need to see this." Thorne moved to stand behind them. The drive wasn't just a collection of files, it was a blueprint. There were architectural drawings of every secure facility on Fort Liberty, but they were overlaid with kill zones for the automated defense towers. There were personnel files for every high-ranking officer on the base, each one marked with a status: asterisk compatible asterisk, asterisk neutral asterisk, or asterisk obstacle asterisk. General Marcus Thorne was marked in red asterisk obstacle asterisk, and next to his name was a photo. It wasn't a standard ID photo. It was a long-range surveillance shot of him eating breakfast on his porch 2 days ago. "This is a hit list," Rodriguez said from the doorway, his hand tightening on his rifle. "It's more than that," Elena said, her finger tracing a line of code on the screen. "It's the who." Huck opened the manifest for the Vanguard update. Huck clicked through a series of subdirectories. A document appeared on the screen, a signed authorization for a deep system diagnostic of the base's security grid. It was dated 3 weeks ago. At the bottom of the page, in the block reserved for civilian oversight, was a signature that made the air in the room feel like it had been sucked out. Asterisk Dr. Aris Thorne. Asterisk the silence that followed was absolute. Thorne didn't move. He didn't breathe. He stared at the name of his wife, the elegant script looking like a jagged scar on the screen. The woman Elena had seen in the Lexus, the woman whose vehicle had carried the wake-up transponder. "Marcus," Elena said softly. "I'm sorry." Thorne's face was a mask of stone, but Elena could see the tremor in his hands. This was the cost of the mission, the realization that the foundation of his life was built on a lie. The woman he shared a bed with was the one who had signed the order to turn the base into a slaughterhouse. She told me it was a routine audit," Thorne said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "She said the Apex people were there to ensure the safety of the transition. I trusted her." "That's how they do it," Elena said. "They find the gap. They find the person you can't say no to. They didn't just hack the base, Marcus. They hacked you." Suddenly, the shack's old rotary phone on the wall began to ring. The sound was jarring, a shrill, mechanical trill that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. Nobody moved. "It shouldn't be able to ring," Huck said, her voice trembling. "The line was cut years ago." "Answer it," Elena said. Thorne reached out and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. He held it to his ear. He didn't say hello, he just waited. "Marcus," a woman's voice came through the line. It was Aris. Her voice was calm, melodic, and entirely devoid of the warmth Elena had seen in her photo. "I know you're in the shack. I know you have the Master Sergeant with you. You always did have a weakness for the damaged ones, didn't you?" "Aris," Thorne said, his voice flat. "Why?" "Because the system is broken, Marcus," she said, and Elena could hear the sound of a glass clinking against ice in the background. "The military is an anachronism, a blunt instrument in a world of scalpels. Apex and the others. We're the ones who actually keep the peace. We just needed to clear out the old growth to make room for the new. You were supposed to be part of it. You were supposed to be the face of the new integrated defense command. But you just couldn't stop being a soldier, could you?" "I'm coming for you, Aris," Thorne said. "No, Marcus, you're staying right there," she said. "The CRAM on Tower 7 has a direct line of sight to that shack. It's been slaved to my tablet. I have a geofence around that building. If anyone steps outside or if the Master Sergeant tries to transmit that data, the tower will level the shack in 4 seconds. You have 10 minutes to decide. Give me the override code for the regional grid or we'll start with the barracks of the 82nd. Thousands of your boys, Marcus. One click. The line went dead. Thorne slowly hung up the phone. He looked at Elena, then at Huck, then at the Rangers. The weight of the world was on his shoulders, and for the first time in his 30-year career, he looked like he might break. "She's bluffing," Rodriguez said. "She won't fire on the barracks." "She will," Elena said. "She's already deleted me. She's already tried to delete the general. To people like Aris, people are just data points. And right now, the 82nd is a data point she can use to get what she wants." The institutional failure wasn't just a glitch in the software. It was a failure of the heart. The very system designed to protect the country had been weaponized by the people who claimed to be its stewards. The grinding failure Elena had felt at the gate was now a physical reality, a wall of steel and fire that had them trapped in a rotting cinderblock shack. "We have 10 minutes, Thorne said. He looked at Elena. "What do we do, Master Sergeant? You're the one who sees the spectrum. Tell me what I'm missing." Elena closed her eyes. She reached out with her mind, trying to visualize the network, the way the signals were flowing through the air, through the copper wires, through the silicon. She thought about the ghost in the machine, the parasite that was feeding on the base's power. "The tower," Elena said. "It's automated, but it's still hardware. It needs a target lock. It's using the infrared signature of our bodies and the electromagnetic bleed from the tough book. So we turn it off?" Huck asked. "No," Elena said. "We give it a different target. Huck, can you spoof the general's command signature, not the override, but a relocate command for the defense grid?" "I can try," Huck said, her fingers already flying. "But I need a powerful transmitter. This tough book doesn't have the range to hit the tower." "Use the old equipment," Elena said, pointing to the rusting racks of Cold War tech. "The manual patch panels. They're still connected to the base's underground copper trunk lines. If we can bypass the digital layer and send a raw analog pulse, we can blind the tower's sensors." "It'll burn out the equipment," Huck warned. "It might even blow the breaker for the whole sector." "Do it," Thorne said. As Huck began to rip wires from the back of the tough book and jam them into the ancient patch panels, Elena stood up and walked to the corner of the room. She found a discarded piece of chalk and began to draw a diagram on the floor, a map of the signal's path. She was in the gray space now, that narrow, terrifying ledge where logic met instinct. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Rodriguez. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "I'm sorry about everything, about how they treated you. If we get out of this, I'm going to make sure people know." Elena looked at him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the simple, honest loyalty of a soldier. It was the same look she had seen in Miller's eyes at the gate. It was the only thing that still made sense in a world that had gone insane. "Don't worry about me, Rodriguez," she said. "Just make sure the general doesn't do anything stupid." 7 minutes, Thorne said, checking his watch. The air in the shack was getting warmer, the ancient tubes in the radio equipment beginning to glow a dull, angry orange. The smell of burning insulation began to fill the room, a sharp chemical sting that made Elena's eyes water. "I've got the signature," Huck yelled. "I'm ready to send. But I need someone to manually hold the relay closed. It's too high voltage for the switch. It'll arc and fail if it isn't held down." Thorne stepped forward, but Elena was faster. She pushed him aside, her strength surprising both of them. "No, Marcus," she said. "You have to be the one to talk to the TOC once the grid goes down. You're the only one they'll listen to. I'm the ghost. Remember, I don't exist." Elena grabbed a pair of rubber-handled pliers from the desk. She stepped to the main patch panel where 2 thick copper bars were held apart by a heavy spring. This was the relay. If she held it closed, the raw power of the shack's transformer would surge through the tough book and into the base's grid, carrying the spoofed signal. "It's going to kick," Huck warned. "A lot." "I've had worse," Elena said. She looked at Thorne. For a second, the years of rank and protocol disappeared. They were just 2 soldiers in a hole, facing an enemy they couldn't see. 4 minutes, Thorne said. "Do it, Huck," Elena commanded. Huck hit the enter key. The room exploded into a deafening hum. Elena slammed the pliers onto the copper bars, forcing them together. Instantly, a bright blue arc of electricity jumped between the bars, lighting up the shack like a lightning strike. Elena felt the shock travel through the pliers, through her arms and into her chest. It felt like her heart was being seized by a giant, icy hand. Her muscles locked, her teeth grinding together so hard she thought they might shatter. The smell of her own singed hair filled her nostrils. "Hold it!" Huck screamed over the roar of the current. "Almost there, 5 more seconds." Elena's vision began to blur. The world narrowed down to the blue light and the vibrating copper bars. She could hear the CRAM tower outside, the heavy whirring of its motors as it began to pivot. its sensors confused by the massive surge of electromagnetic noise. Suddenly, there was a loud asterisk pop asterisk, and the shack was plunged into darkness. The hum died. The blue light vanished. Elena slumped against the patch panel, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she could taste the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Outside, there was a different sound, the sound of silence. Thorne was at the door, peering out through a crack. "The tower! It's powered down, it's dead. The whole sector just went dark." "The surge worked," Huck said, her voice shaky but triumphant. "I sent the blind command. Every automated sensor on this side of the base just had its brains fried." Thorne turned to Elena. He helped her up, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You did it, Elena. You bought us a window." "Don't celebrate yet," Elena whispered, her voice raspy. "The backup grid will kick in within 5 minutes, and Aris will know what we did. She'll send the ground teams." "Then we don't wait for them," Thorne said, his voice regaining its hard, serrated edge. "Rodriguez, get the team ready. We're going to the TOC. If we can't stop the system from here, we take it back by force." "Sir," Rodriguez said, already moving toward the Suburban. Elena leaned against the desk, her body aching, her mind racing. She looked at the tough book. It was smoking, the screen black and melted. The USB drive was gone, vaporized in the surge. "The data," Huck said, looking at the ruin of the laptop. "We lost the evidence." "No," Elena said, reaching into the pocket of the tactical jacket. She pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the manifest she had seen on the screen, which she had managed to copy down while Huck was working. "I have the names of the Apex handlers, and I have the frequency they are using to communicate with the cleaners." She looked at Thorne. "We don't need the drive, Marcus. We have the source, and the source is in the main server room, the Hive." Thorne nodded. "The Hive is the most secure room on the base. It's buried 60 feet underground beneath the Roman 18 Corps headquarters. It has its own power, its own air, and a squad of special forces guarding it." "But they are not your special forces," Elena said. "Look at the manifest. The security contract for the Hive was privatized 6 months ago. The men guarding that room are Apex contractors. The institutional failure was complete. The heart of the base had been handed over to the enemy under the guise of efficiency." "Then we're going to have to break into our own house," Thorne said. As they piled back into the Suburban, the rain finally began to fall. A cold, driving Carolina rain that washed the dust and blood from Elena's skin, but couldn't touch the fire burning inside her. They drove with the lights off, the vehicle a ghost in the dark, moving through a base that was slowly waking up to the fact that it was under siege. The drive to the TOC was a nightmare of navigating around automated checkpoints that were now hostile. They had to cut through training fields and over tank trails, the Suburban's engine roaring as it clawed through the mud. Elena sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the darkness. She was thinking about Aris. She was thinking about the woman who had traded the lives of thousands of soldiers for a more efficient world. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt a cold, clinical determination. She was the one who saw the ghosts, and now she was going to be the one who laid them to rest. "We're 2 clicks from the TOC," Rodriguez reported. "We have multiple contact reports on the radio. The base is in a state of total confusion. Some units are trying to lock down, others are being engaged by the automated towers." "The system is eating itself," Elena said. They reached the perimeter of the Roman 18 Corps headquarters. The massive concrete building sat like a fortress in the center of a wide, open plaza. The plaza was illuminated by high-powered floodlights, and Elena could see the shapes of men in black tactical gear moving near the entrance. "Apex. They've set up a perimeter," Thorne said, observing through his binoculars. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They're treating the TOC like a private facility." "We can't go through the front," Elena said. "They'll see us coming from a mile away." "There's a maintenance tunnel," Huck said, leaning forward between the front seats. "It runs from the old boiler room to the sub-basement of the Hive. It was sealed off in the 90s, but I found the schematics in the digital archive. If we can get into the boiler room, we can get under them." Thorne looked at Elena. "Can you do it? You're in no condition to be crawling through tunnels." Elena looked at her hands. They were still shaking from the shock, and the burns on her palms were raw and painful. She felt the weight of the 16 years she had spent in the gray space, the weight of the friends she had lost, the rank she had been stripped of, and the identity they had tried to erase. "I'm the only one who knows the frequency to unlock the server racks, Marcus," she said. "You're stuck with me." They left the Suburban in a grove of trees and moved on foot, staying in the shadows of the massive brick buildings. The air was filled with the sound of distant sirens and the occasional asterisk thud 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 asterisk of a CRAM firing at an unknown target. The boiler room was a cavernous space filled with hissing pipes and the smell of ancient coal dust. They found the entrance to the maintenance tunnel, a heavy iron grate hidden behind a stack of rusted drums. Rodriguez and another ranger pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow hole that smelled of damp earth and decay. "I'll lead," Rodriguez said, clicking on a red-filtered flashlight. They crawled for what felt like miles, the tunnel so narrow that Elena's shoulders scraped the sides. The air was thick and stagnant, and the only sound was the rhythmic asterisk thump asterisk of their boots and the distant vibration of the base's generators. Finally, the tunnel ended at a heavy steel door with a digital keypad. "This is it," Huck whispered. "The sub-basement. We're directly under the server room." Elena stepped forward. She looked at the keypad. It was a modern model integrated into the Apex network. "I need your tablet, Huck," Elena said. She connected the tablet to the keypad's diagnostic port. She didn't try to hack the code. She looked at the power draw. She began to tap a rhythm on the keys, the same 440 Hz pulse she had used before. The lock clicked. The door swung open. They stepped into a room that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. It was a vast, white-tiled space filled with rows of humming server racks, their blue and green lights flickering in the dark. The air was freezing, cooled by a massive liquid nitrogen system. In the center of the room was a glass-walled command pod. Inside, 3 men in black tactical gear were hunched over monitors, their faces illuminated by the glow of the data. "Apex," Thorne whispered, his hand on his sidearm. "Wait," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the main monitor in the pod. "Look at the data stream. They're not just controlling the defenses, they're uploading the entire tactical database to an external server. They're selling the core." Suddenly, the lights in the server room turned bright red. A siren began to scream, a high-pitched, piercing tone that felt like a needle in the ear. "Breach detected," a calm, synthetic voice announced over the speakers. "Initiating purge protocol." The men in the command pod turned, their weapons raised. "Go!" Thorne shouted. The server room erupted into a chaos of gunfire and shattering glass. The Rangers moved with surgical precision, taking cover behind the server racks and returning fire. Elena dived for a terminal at the edge of the room, her fingers flying across the keys as she tried to bypass the purge protocol. "They're locking down the cooling system," Huck yelled, crouched next to her. "If the servers overheat, the data will be wiped. Everything we need to prove the conspiracy will be gone." "I'm on it," Elena shouted back. She saw the code, a complex self-replicating virus that was eating its way through the server's operating system. It was the same parasite she had seen at the gate, but this time it was at its full strength. She felt the cold rage again, the quiet, focused competence of a master sergeant who refused to lose the mission. She didn't fight the virus, she fed it. She created a data loop that trapped the virus in a corner of the memory, giving her a few seconds of access to the core. "Huck, I need the command override for the liquid nitrogen." "I can't get it," Huck shouted over the roar of the gunfire. "It's behind a physical firewall." Elena looked across the room. The physical firewall was a manual lever located next to the command pod. To reach it, someone would have to cross 20 feet of open floor, directly into the line of fire of the Apex contractors. "I've got it," Rodriguez yelled. He lunged from behind a server rack, his rifle spitting fire. He made it halfway across the floor before a burst of fire from the pod caught him in the shoulder. He spun around, his blood spraying across the white tiles, but he didn't stop. He dragged himself toward the lever, his face contorted in pain. "Rodriguez!" Thorne shouted, providing suppressing fire. Rodriguez reached the lever. With a final, agonizing effort, he pulled it down. A cloud of white vapor erupted from the floor as the liquid nitrogen surged back into the cooling system. The servers hummed back to life, the temperature gauges dropping instantly. Elena hit the final key. The red lights vanished. The sirens died. The screens in the command pod went blank. "System override complete," the synthetic voice said. "Control restored to local authority." The remaining Apex contractors in the pod dropped their weapons, realizing the game was over. Thorne and the Rangers moved in, securing the area with a grim efficiency. Thorne knelt next to Rodriguez, who was pale and shaking but still conscious. "Hang in there, son. You did good." Elena stood up, her body trembling with exhaustion. She looked at the main monitor. The upload had been stopped. The data was safe. But as she looked at the logs, she saw something that made her heart stop. The purge protocol hadn't been triggered by their entry into the room. It had been triggered by a remote command from outside the base, from the Thorne residence. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "She's not just selling the data, she's cleaning the house. She's already activated the self-destruct for the TOC." Thorne looked at her, his eyes wide. "What?" "The Vanguard update," Elena said, pointing to a countdown on the screen that was now at 2 minutes. "It's not just software. There's a thermite charge in the main power junction. If we don't clear the building in 2 minutes, the whole TOC is going to be a crater." Thorne didn't hesitate. "Everyone out now, carry the wounded. Go, go, go." The Rangers grabbed Rodriguez and began to run for the maintenance tunnel. Huck followed them, her eyes wide with terror, but Elena stayed. "Elena, let's go," Thorne shouted, grabbing her arm. "No," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "If the thermite goes off, it'll destroy the servers, all the evidence, the names of the other contractors, the politicians involved. It'll all be gone. I can stop it, Marcus. I can bypass the charges detonator from here." "The building is going to blow, Elena. You don't have time." "I have 80 seconds, Elena said, her voice cold and steady. "I've done this before in a cave in Tora Bora. I can do it here. Go, Marcus, that's an order." Thorne stared at her for a long second. He saw the woman who had been erased, the woman who had lost everything but her honor. He saw the soldier he had saluted in the dirt. "Don't you dare die in my TOC, Master Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned and ran for the tunnel. Elena sat back down at the terminal. She didn't look at the countdown. She didn't look at the white vapor still swirling around her feet. She looked at the code. She found the detonator's frequency. It was a complex, shifting wave designed to be impossible to jam, but Elena wasn't going to jam it. She was going to spoof the confirmation signal, telling the detonator that the charge had already exploded. 40 seconds. Her fingers moved with a precision that was beyond thought. She was part of the machine now, a ghost in the very system that was trying to kill her. 20 seconds. She found the final gate. She typed the code, the service number she had carried for 16 years, the only thing they hadn't been able to take from her. *7 to 2 to 9 to 4 to 1 to 1 to 0. *10 seconds. The screen flickered. The countdown stopped at 0004. Detonation confirmed, simulated. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She slumped back in the chair, her head lolling against the headrest. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the gentle hum of the servers. She had done it. The data was safe. The building was safe. But she was still 60 feet underground, and the Apex ground teams would be converging on the TOC at any moment. She stood up, her legs feeling like water. She began to walk toward the maintenance tunnel, her footsteps echoing on the white tiles. As she reached the door, she saw a shadow in the corner. It was one of the Apex contractors. He had been hidden behind a server rack, his weapon raised. He was bleeding from a wound in his side, but his eyes were clear and filled with a cold, professional hate. "You," he spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You ruined everything." Elena didn't have a weapon, she didn't have a shield. She just looked at him with those piercing blue eyes. "The mission is over," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "You lost," the man sneered. "I didn't lose, I'm just the first wave. You think you stopped a conspiracy? You just kicked a hornet's nest, Master Sergeant." He raised his weapon to her head. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the maintenance tunnel. The man's head snapped back, a spray of red hitting the server rack behind him. He crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Elena turned. Thorne was standing at the entrance to the tunnel, his sidearm still smoking. He was alone. "I told you not to die in my TOC, he said, his voice shaking. "I'm a hard woman to kill, Marcus," Elena said. They walked together back through the tunnel, emerging into the cold night air of Fort Liberty. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sirens were getting louder. In the distance, Elena could see the lights of a massive convoy approaching the TOC, the real military police, the real Rangers, the real army. The siege was over. But as Elena stood in the shadows of the building, watching Thorne take command of the arriving forces, she felt a sudden, sharp vibration in her pocket. It was the Motorola radio she had taken from the driver of the Explorer. It was still working. She pulled it out and held it to her ear. "Master Sergeant Vance," a voice said. It wasn't Aris. It was a man's voice, smooth, cultured, and entirely unfamiliar. "You performed admirably tonight. You've successfully dismantled a very expensive piece of infrastructure, but don't mistake a tactical victory for a strategic one." Elena didn't say anything. "We'll be seeing you soon, Elena," the voice said. Bluefield is a beautiful town this time of year. It would be a shame if something happened to it. The radio went dead. Elena looked at the radio, then at the general, then at the soldiers who were finally doing their jobs. She realized then that the who on the drive was just the beginning. The conspiracy didn't end at Apex or at Dr. Thorne. It went higher into the very shadows she had spent her life hunting. She looked at her hands. They were scarred, burned, and shaking. But she also saw the strength in them. She saw the woman who had refused to be erased. She walked toward Thorne, her head held high, the tactical jacket draped over her shoulders like armor. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a soldier, and she was ready for the next mission. But as she reached the general, she saw the look on his face. He was staring at his phone, his face pale in the light of the floodlights. "Marcus," she asked, "what is it?" Thorne looked at her, his eyes filled with a sudden primal fear. "Eris," he whispered, "she just sent me a message. She's not at the house. She's at Womack." Elena's heart froze. "The hospital? Why?" "She says she's there to finish the audit," Thorne said. "And Elena, she says she's with Specialist Miller." Elena didn't wait for an order. She didn't wait for a vehicle. She began to run. The ghost in the machine wasn't gone. It had just moved to a new target. And this time it was personal. The mud of North Carolina in late October is a specific kind of cruel, a thick red clay that clings to boots and tires like a desperate memory. As the Suburban lurched away from the signals shack, Elena felt the vibration of the engine deep in her marrow, a low-frequency hum that contested the jagged rhythm of her own heart. To her left, Rodriguez was checking the seating of a fresh magazine into his MK-18, the metallic asterisk clackslide asterisk, a final punctuation mark on the silence. Outside, the longleaf pines were silhouettes against a sky turning the color of a bruised plum. The base was dying around them. The lights of the distant barracks were flickering out, sector by sector, as the automated grid Eris Thorne had subverted began to cannibalize its own power. Elena watched the shadows. She didn't see trees. She saw the absence of signals, the dead zones where the CRAM towers were pivoting, their infrared eyes searching for the heat signatures of the men they were built to protect. Thorne sat in the front, his profile a jagged edge of granite against the dim green glow of the dashboard. He hadn't spoken since he hung up the phone. He didn't need to. The betrayal was a physical weight in the vehicle, heavier than the armored plating. Elena reached out, her hand hovering over the flickering Toughbook screen Huck was trying to revive. She could feel the electromagnetic bleed coming off the device, a sharp, copper-tasting static on the back of her tongue. It was a sensation she had lived with since the blast in Jalalabad, a neurological glitch that the army doctors had called sensory processing disorder, but what Elena knew was something else entirely. She didn't just hear the radio, she felt the shape of the wave. She didn't just see the network, she felt the pulse of the data. And right now, the pulse was a frantic, dying heartbeat. "Get us to the tree line at the edge of the parade field," Thorne said, his voice a low rasp that barely cleared the rumble of the tires. "We can't take the asphalt. The sensors in the road are weighted. They'll trigger the mortar pits at the TOC perimeter if they detect a vehicle this heavy." "Sir," the driver whispered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The Suburban veered off the gravel, the suspension screaming as it hit the uneven turf of the training grounds. Elena braced herself, her hand gripping the door handle, the burns on her palm from the shack's electrical arc beginning to weep through the makeshift bandages. The pain was good. It was a tether. It kept her from drifting too far into the gray space, that place where the world dissolved into pure frequency and she forgot how to breathe. She looked at Rodriguez. He was watching her. He saw the way her eyes were tracking things that weren't there, the way her pupils dilated every time a radio burst hit the encrypted channel. He didn't ask questions. He just handed her a pair of heavy tactical gloves. "Put them on, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice devoid of the pity she usually received from the officer corps. "You're going to need your hands." The Roman 18 Corps headquarters, known as the TOC, loomed out of the darkness like a concrete monolith. It was a windowless fortress, designed to withstand a nuclear near-miss, but tonight it looked like a tomb. The perimeter lights were dead, but the plaza was bathed in the harsh, artificial white of portable floodlights. Elena saw the movement, the black silhouettes of Apex contractors. They weren't moving like soldiers on a base. They were moving like an occupying force. They had established interlocking fields of fire across the open concrete, their suppressed weapons held at the low-ready. There were no American flags visible in the plaza, just the cold corporate efficiency of men who were paid to be lethal. "They're not 82nd," Huck whispered, her voice trembling as she looked through her thermal monocular. "They're not even US-coded gear. I'm seeing Tier 1 signatures, but the encryption on their comms is... It's different. It's Apex." "It's a corporate coup," Elena said, her voice flat, devoid of the shock that Thorne was clearly fighting. She could feel the signal coming from the building, a massive, high-bandwidth upload. "They're not just holding the building, Marcus. They're stripping it. Every file, every asset, every undercover identity in the Roman 18-core database is being mirrored to a server in Virginia. They're liquidating the Army's intelligence branch." Thorne turned his head slowly. The look in his eyes was one of a man who had realized the war he was fighting wasn't the one he was in. "The maintenance tunnel," he said. "Huck, you're sure about the access?" "The boiler room is 300 yards to the east," Huck said, pointing toward a low-slung brick structure that looked like an afterthought. "The tunnel was part of the original 1950s infrastructure. It's not on the digital map." Aris. She wouldn't have thought to lock it down because it doesn't exist in the system she hacked. "Move," Thorne commanded. They spilled out of the Suburban, moving in a low crouch through the tall grass of the parade field. The rain began to fall then, a cold, needles and pins drizzle that smelled of wet earth and impending winter. Elena felt the moisture seep into her hospital gown, the thin fabric clinging to her skin, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt the vibration of the boiler room's massive fans, a rhythmic asterisk thrum 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 asterisk that synchronized with her pulse. The boiler room smelled of ancient coal dust and hot iron. It was a cavernous space, filled with the hissing of steam pipes that looked like the veins of some subterranean beast. Rodriguez moved to the back, shifting a stack of rusted chemical drums with a grunt of effort. Beneath them was a heavy iron grate, secured with a chain that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Nixon administration. Rodriguez didn't use a torch. He used a pair of bolt cutters, the snap of the metal echoing through the room like a gunshot. "I'll lead," Rodriguez said, clicking on a red-filtered flashlight. The tunnel was a nightmare of compressed space. It was barely 3 feet wide, the walls slick with a black, oily residue that smelled of decay and stale ozone. Elena crawled behind Rodriguez, her knees scraping the rough concrete, her breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps. The claustrophobia was a physical hand around her throat, but she pushed through it, focusing on the signal. She could feel the talk server room above them, a massive, humming hive of data. It was getting closer. The frequency was rising, a high-pitched whine in her inner ear that made her teeth ache. "Stop," Rodriguez whispered. He had reached a steel door at the end of the tunnel. It was modern, an island of high-tech security in a sea of crumbling concrete. A digital keypad glowed with a soft blue light, its surface reflecting the red of Rodriguez's flashlight. "Huck, get up here," Thorne hissed from behind Elena. The corporal scrambled forward, but the tunnel was too narrow for her to pass Elena. Elena felt the heat of Huck's panic, the way the girl's hands were shaking as she tried to reach for her tablet. I can't get the angle," Huck whispered, her voice cracking. "I need to see the circuitry." "Give me the tablet," Elena said. Her voice was a command, one that bypassed the fear in the tunnel. Huck handed the device over. Elena didn't look at the screen. She didn't look at the keypad. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm against the steel of the door. She felt it. The flow of electrons through the copper wires, the rhythmic gate switching of the processor. It was a language she spoke better than English. She could feel the handshake. The moment the keypad asked the server for permission to open. She didn't try to break the code, she looked for the echo. Every keypad has a ghost, a tiny electromagnetic resonance left behind by the most frequently used numbers. 7, Elena whispered, her eyes still closed. 2, 9, 4, 1. She punched the numbers in. The lock clicked, a heavy mechanical thud that felt like a victory. The door swung open, and the air that hit them was 40 degrees colder, smelling of liquid nitrogen and the sterile, antiseptic scent of a cleanroom. They stepped into the sub-basement of the hive. It was a space of pure geometry, white tiles, glass walls, and rows of black server racks that stretched into the darkness like the pillars of a digital cathedral. The only light came from the flickering LEDs of the processors, a staccato dance of blue, green, and amber. In the center of the room was the command pod, a raised platform surrounded by monitors. Elena saw the Apex contractors before they saw her. There were 3 of them dressed in sleek, black tactical gear that looked more like sportswear than a uniform. They weren't looking at the door. They were watching the progress bars on their screens, their faces illuminated by the glow of the stolen data. "Contact," Rodriguez breathed. The room exploded. It wasn't like the movies. There was no slow-motion grace. It was a sudden, violent collision of physics and intent. Rodriguez's MK-18 barked, the suppressed shots sounding like heavy coughs in the chilled air. One of the contractors in the pod was slammed back against his monitor, a spray of red blooming against the glass. The other two dived for cover, their own weapons raking the server racks with fire. Elena dived behind a rack, the sound of bullets shattering the glass of a cooling unit right above her head. A cloud of white vapor, liquid nitrogen, erupted into the room, obscuring her vision and turning the floor into a sheet of ice. "Elena, get to the terminal!" Thorne shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. She didn't wait. She crawled through the vapor, the freezing gas stinging her lungs. She could feel the servers around her, the massive, surging flow of information. It was like standing in the middle of a waterfall. The Apex team wasn't just downloading, they were deleting the originals as they went. They were erasing the Roman 18 core memory. She reached the edge of the command pod, her hands finding the edge of a metal desk. She pulled herself up, her vision blurring as a fresh wave of data stress hit her brain. The monitors in the pod were a chaotic mess of scrolling code and architectural blueprints. "Breach detected," a calm, synthetic voice announced over the intercom. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't Aris. It was a recording, the base's AI, now slave to the invaders. "Initiating purge protocol. Thermal charges armed in sectors 1 through 9. The thermite," Elena whispered. She saw the countdown on the main screen, 0200. The TOC wasn't just being hacked, it was being rigged to self-destruct. The Vanguard update Aris had signed wasn't just a software patch, it was a demolition order. Every server, every piece of hardware, every scrap of evidence, it was all going to be turned into molten slag in 120 seconds. "Marcus!" Elena screamed. "They're burning it." All of it. Thorne was suppressed behind a rack 10 feet away, pinned down by a contractor with a high cyclocrate submachine gun. Elena looked at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The code was a wall, a beautiful, terrifying masterpiece of encryption. It was the same parasite she had seen at the gate, but here in its home environment, it was a god. It was rewriting its own security protocols faster than she could read them. "Huck, I need the root access for the cooling system." Elena yelled, her voice straining against the noise. "I can't get in." Huck screamed from the floor. "The firewall is physical. There's a manual override lever next to the pod." Elena looked. The lever was there, a bright red handle located on the side of the command pod, completely exposed to the line of fire. Rodriguez saw it too. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at Elena. He looked at the lever, and then he looked at the contractor who was currently shredding the server rack he was hiding behind. "Cover me!" Rodriguez roared. He didn't wait for a response. He lunged from behind the rack, his boots sliding on the nitrogen-slicked floor. He was a blur of tan nylon and focused aggression. He fired as he ran, his shots forcing the contractor in the pod to duck, but there was a second shooter, the one Elena hadn't seen. A burst of fire caught Rodriguez in the shoulder. He spun, his rifle flying from his hands, but his momentum carried him forward. He slammed into the side of the pod, his blood painting a jagged streak across the white plastic. He reached up, his fingers clawing for the lever. "No!" Elena screamed. Rodriguez grabbed the handle and threw his entire weight onto it. There was a loud, metallic asterisk clunk asterisk, and a fresh torrent of liquid nitrogen surged into the room. The servers hummed, the temperature gauges on the monitors dropping from the red into the deep blue. The second shooter stood up, aiming his weapon at the back of Rodriguez's head. Elena didn't think. She didn't reach for a gun she didn't have. She reached for the terminal. She didn't type code. She didn't look for a back door. She reached into the gray space, letting the signals of the room flood her mind until she could no longer feel her own body. She felt the contractor's comm link, a high-frequency burst of encrypted audio. She felt the internal speaker of the command pod. She grabbed the signal and twisted it. A deafening 140-decibel screech erupted from the contractor's headset, a feedback loop of pure, agonizing sound. The man screamed, clutching his ears, his weapon firing blindly into the ceiling. He fell to his knees, blood trickling from under his ear cups. Elena collapsed against the desk, her nose bleeding, her vision swimming with black spots. The cost of the surge was a migraine that felt like a hot needle being driven into her temple. "Elena, the timer." Thorne was at her side now, his hand on her shoulder, shaking her. 0045, she looked at the screen. The thermite charges were armed. The confirmation signal was waiting for a final handshake from the remote server from Aris's tablet. I can't stop the timer, Elena gasped, her voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away. But I can spoof the detonation. If I can tell the system the building has already blown, it might cancel the sequence. Do it, Thorne said. He was looking at Rodriguez, who was slumped against the pod, his face the color of wood ash. Elena's fingers moved. They didn't feel like her fingers. They felt like extensions of the machine. She was no longer Master Sergeant Elena Vance. She was a variable in a high-stakes equation. She saw the code for the detonator. It was a shifting wave, a complex algorithm designed to prevent jamming. She didn't jam it. She fed it. She took her own Army service number, the one they had tried to delete, and she used it as a seed for a new algorithm. She wrapped it in the 440 Hz pulse she had recorded from the Tahoe. She created a ghost of a detonation, a digital echo that mimicked the thermal and seismic signature of a thermite explosion. 0020. The room was silent now, except for the hiss of the nitrogen and the frantic clicking of the keys. The remaining Apex contractor was unconscious or dead. Huck was crawling toward Rodriguez, her hands covered in his blood as she tried to apply a tourniquet. 0010. Elena hit the enter key. The screen flickered. The red countdown vanished, replaced by a single line of green text. Asterisk detonation confirmed, simulated. Purge sequence terminated. Asterisk Elena fell back into the chair, her chest heaving. The silence that followed was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket of relief and exhaustion. She looked at Thorne. He looked old. The granite of his face had crumbled, leaving behind a man who was realizing the scale of the wreckage. We have the data, Elena whispered. I stopped the upload, everything is still here. It doesn't matter, Thorne said, his voice hollow. He was looking at his phone, the screen was glowing in the dark. She's gone, Elena, Aris. The GPS on her vehicle just went dead at the edge of the base. She's out. We'll find her, Elena said, but she didn't believe it. Aris Thorne wasn't a woman who left a trail. They began the long, agonizing process of extraction. Thorne and Huck carried Rodriguez between them, the Ranger's breath a wet, rattling sound in the quiet of the sub-basement. Elena followed, her legs feeling like they were made of glass. She looked back at the server room one last time. It was a graveyard of blue light and white vapor. They emerged from the maintenance tunnel into the cold Carolina rain. The base was no longer silent. Sirens were wailing in the distance, and the rhythmic asterisk thud-thud-thud asterisk of a helicopter echoed over the trees. The real military was finally waking up. A convoy of Humvees and MPs was screaming toward the TOC, their blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Thorne stood in the middle of the road, his hand raised, his general's stars catching the light. He looked like a king standing in the ruins of his own palace. General Thorne, an MP shouted, jumping out of the lead vehicle. Sir, we have reports of a breach at the TOC. We have the perimeter locked down. The breach is contained, Thorne said, his voice regaining its command. I need a medevac for this soldier, now, and I need a secure line to the Pentagon. This is a Level 1 national security event. Elena stepped back into the shadows of the boiler room, the tactical jacket Thorne had given her wrapped tight around her body. She watched as the medics loaded Rodriguez into an ambulance, watched as Huck was taken aside by an intelligence officer, watched as Thorne was surrounded by a phalanx of colonels and majors. She was the ghost again, the woman in the torn hospital gown who didn't exist in the manifest. She reached into her pocket and felt the Motorola radio. It was vibrating. She pulled it out, the screen glowing with an unknown frequency. She held it to her ear, stepping further into the darkness of the pines. Master Sergeant Vance, the voice said. It was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of heat. It wasn't Aris. It was a man's voice, one that sounded like it belonged in a boardroom or a tomb. You've been very busy tonight. Elena didn't answer. She felt the signal, a high-orbit satellite bounce. This wasn't a local call. You think you've won, the voice continued. You think you've saved your little army, but the data you saved, it's already obsolete, Elena. We didn't need the files, we just needed the distraction. Who is this? Elena rasped, her voice breaking. A friend of the future, the man said. Bluefield, Montana is a beautiful town, Elena. Your mother still lives on that little farm on the edge of the valley, doesn't she? The one with the red barn and the broken fence. It would be a tragedy if the automated systems in that county had a sudden, unfortunate malfunction. The line went dead. Elena stared at the radio, the cold of the rain finally penetrating the adrenaline. The world didn't feel solid anymore. It felt like a thin sheet of ice over a dark, bottomless ocean. She had fought the battle in the TOC, she had saved the data, she had protected the general. But the war wasn't on Fort Liberty. It was everywhere. It was in the air, in the wires, in the very heart of the country she served. She walked back toward the road, her footsteps heavy in the red mud. She saw Thorne looking for her, his eyes searching the shadows. He saw her, and for a moment the two of them just stood there, separated by 20 feet of asphalt and a lifetime of secrets. "Elena," he said, stepping toward her. "We're going to the hospital. We're going to get you cleaned up. We're going to fix this." Elena looked at him, and for the first time she let the control slip. She let him see the fear, the exhaustion, the absolute shattering weight of what she knew. "Marcus," she said, her voice a whisper that was lost in the sound of the rain. "Aris, she's not at the house." Thorne stopped. "What do you mean?" He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he opened a new message. He read it, and Elena saw the moment the last of the man died. His face didn't just go pale, it went hollow, the skin tightening over his cheekbones until he looked like a skull. "She's at Womack," Thorne whispered. "The hospital. She says she's there to finish the audit," Thorne said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching helicopter. "And Elena, she says she's with Specialist Miller." Elena felt the world tilt. Specialist Miller, the young guard who had given her his jacket, the boy who had looked at her with respect instead of suspicion. The only person who had seen her as a human being in the middle of the nightmare. The ghost wasn't finished with them. It was just moving to a more vulnerable target. Elena didn't wait for Thorne to call for a car. She didn't wait for the MPs. She turned and began to run toward the distant lights of the hospital, her bare feet hitting the cold, wet pavement with a rhythmic asterisk slap 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 asterisk that sounded like a countdown. She had spent 16 years being a ghost, hiding in the frequencies, watching the world through a screen. But as she ran through the rain, the blood from her palms staining the white fabric of her gown, she knew that the time for hiding was over. The institutional failure was complete. The chain of command was broken. The only thing left was the mission. And the mission was a young boy in a hospital room who didn't know the monster was already in the building. She ran until her lungs burned, until her heart felt like it was going to burst through her ribs. She didn't look back at the TOC. She didn't look back at the general. She looked ahead at the sterile, white towers of Womack, where the final reckoning was waiting in the dark. She was Master Sergeant Elena Vance. She was a signals intelligence expert. She was a ghost, and she was the only thing standing between the boy and the dark. The immediate aftermath of the TOC battle was a blur of blue lights and shouted orders, but Elena was already a mile away, a shadow moving through the rain. She could feel the hospital's grid, a massive, pulsing network of life support systems and security cameras. It was a target-rich environment, and Aris Thorne was already inside. Elena reached the perimeter of the hospital grounds, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stopped for a moment, leaning against a brick wall, her eyes scanning the building. She didn't look at the windows, she looked at the EM spectrum. She saw it immediately. A localized jammer operating on a frequency that was identical to the one the Apex contractors had used. It was centered on the 4th floor. The IQ. They were going to kill him. They were going to kill Miller not because he was a threat, but because he was a loose end. Because he had seen Elena. Because he was the only witness to the beginning of the end. Elena straightened her back, the pain in her ankle a dull, throbbing roar. She adjusted the tactical jacket, her fingers finding the small, jagged piece of glass she had picked up from the server room. It wasn't a weapon, not really. But in the gray space, anything could be a tool. She stepped into the light of the hospital entrance, her face a mask of cold, clinical determination. She wasn't running anymore. She was hunting. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The lobby was empty, the air smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. The receptionist was gone, the monitors on the desk showing nothing but static. The audit had begun. Elena walked toward the elevators, her footsteps silent on the linoleum. She didn't press the button. She reached into the panel, her fingers finding the wires she needed. She didn't hack the elevator, she spoke to it. 4th floor, she whispered, her eyes closing as she felt the surge of the motor. The elevator began to rise, the numbers on the display clicking upward like the beats of a dying heart. Elena stood in the center of the car, her hands at her sides, her vision narrowing down to a single white-hot point of intent. The doors opened on the 4th floor. The hallway was a tunnel of sterile, white light. At the end of the hall, standing in front of a heavy steel door, was a woman in a perfectly tailored gray suit. She was holding a tablet in one hand and a small, silver, silenced pistol in the other. Dr. Aris Thorne. She looked up as the elevator doors opened. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. She looked like a woman who was checking a final item off a long and tedious list. "Master Sergeant," Aris said, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. "You really are quite persistent. It's a shame. You could have been so useful to us." Elena stepped out of the elevator, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. She didn't look at the gun. She looked at the door behind Aris. "Where is he?" Elena asked, her voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Specialist Miller is currently receiving a very specific kind of treatment," Aris said, her thumb hovering over the tablet screen. "A digital recalibration of his heart rate monitor. It's quite painless, I'm told, until the end." "Let him go, Aris," Elena said, stepping forward. "The TOC is secure. Thorne has the data. It's over." Aris laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that had no joy in it. "Oh, Elena, you still think this is about data. This is about the system. The system is being replaced. And you're just an error code that needs to be deleted." Aris raised the pistol. Elena didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just looked at the tablet in Aris's hand. "You shouldn't have used the 440 Hz frequency, Aris," Elena said softly. "It has a very specific resonance, especially when it's near a high-output medical MRI machine." Aris frowned, her finger tightening on the trigger. "What are you talking about?" Elena didn't answer. She reached into the gray space one last time, not for a network, not for a signal, but for the raw, physical power of the building's infrastructure. She felt the MRI suite 3 doors down, a massive, superconducting magnet that was currently on standby. She didn't hack it. She surged it. She threw her mind into the cooling system, bypassing the safety interlocks and dumping the entire reserve of liquid helium into the quench vent. The pressure in the magnet's vessel spiked, and the magnetic field, a force strong enough to pull a car through a wall, erupted into the hallway. The pistol in Aris's hand was ripped away with a violent metallic asterisk clang asterisk, the weapon flying across the hall and embedding itself in the steel door of the MRI suite. The tablet was next. The device shattered as it was sucked toward the magnet. Aris screamed, her body being pulled toward the wall as the metal buttons on her suit and the steel pins in her hair became projectiles. She slammed against the door, her eyes wide with a sudden primal terror. Elena didn't look at her. She walked past the screaming woman, her eyes fixed on the ICU door. She pushed it open. Specialist Miller was lying in the bed, his face pale, his eyes closed. The heart rate monitor was flatlining, a long, continuous beep filling the room. Elena didn't look at the monitor. She looked at the wires. She reached out and ripped the sensor from Miller's finger, her hands steady as she found the manual override for the Roman 4 pump. She didn't need a computer. She felt the rhythm of the machine, and she forced it to slow down. She stayed there for a long time, her hand on Miller's chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart as it returned to its natural rhythm. She didn't look at the door. She didn't look at the chaos in the hallway. She just sat there, a ghost in a torn gown, watching over a boy who would never know her name. The crisis had passed. The reckoning was coming. But for now, in the quiet of the ICU, there was only the sound of a heart beating in the dark. And Elena Vance, finally, was no longer invisible. The coffee in the plastic cup had developed a thin, oily film by 0412, reflecting the sterile, fluorescent hum of the Womack Army Medical Center waiting room where Elena Vance sat, her bare feet still stained with the red clay of the parade field and the copper-scented blood of a boy she barely knew. She didn't drink it. She just held the warmth against her palms, which were now wrapped in clean white gauze that felt too thick, too clumsy, an insulting barrier between her skin and the world of signals she needed to monitor. The hospital didn't smell like the rainy woods or the ozone of the server room anymore. It smelled of floor wax, industrial-grade bleach, and the specific metallic tang of a building trying to keep 500 people from dying at once. Every time a nurse pushed a cart past her, Elena felt the rhythmic asterisk, click-sure asterisk of the wheels in her molars, a low-frequency vibration that told her the bearings in the third wheel were failing. She wasn't alone in the hallway, but she was solitary. 2 military police officers stood 10 feet away, their faces as blank as the cinder block walls, their thumbs hooked into their duty belts. They weren't there to protect her. They were there to ensure the anomaly didn't move until the people with the higher pay grades decided what to do with a master sergeant who wasn't supposed to be on the base, wasn't supposed to be alive, and had just turned a multi-million-dollar MRI suite into a localized EMP to stop the daughter of a 3-star general. The institutional grinding began not with a roar, but with the soft squeak of polished black Oxfords. Colonel Holloway didn't look like a man who had been awake for 24 hours, though the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his glasses gave him away. He was the Roman 18 Corps chief legal officer, a man who dealt in the currency of liability and the architecture of silence. He didn't look at Elena's face. He looked at the clipboard in his hand as if it were a shield. He stopped 3 feet away, maintaining a distance that felt calculated, a buffer zone between the official army and the mess she had created. "Master Sergeant Vance," Holloway said, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the hum of the vending machine. "There are 4 separate agencies currently arguing over who has jurisdiction to interview you. CID is in the building. NSA is on a plane from Meade, and the General's office. Well, the General is currently unavailable for comment." Elena didn't look up. She watched the way the signal from Holloway's encrypted government smartphone pulsed against the back of her retinas, a rhythmic blue-tinged flicker. "Specialist Miller," she said, her voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "Is he stable?" Holloway paused, his eyes flickering toward the MP. He adjusted his glasses again. "The specialist is in post-op. The doctors are?" Confused by the readings they were getting before the power surge. "They're calling it a localized equipment malfunction. That is the official entry in the log, Vance. Equipment malfunction. Do you understand?" "I understand that Aris Thorne tried to kill him with a digital heart stop," Elena said. "What you understand and what can be proven in a court-martial are 2 very different things." Holloway snapped, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. He leaned in closer, and Elena could smell the peppermint he was using to hide the scent of stress sweat. "You entered a restricted area without authorization. You engaged in a kinetic confrontation with a civilian contractor. You destroyed a Tier 1 medical asset, and you did it all while being listed as AWOL from a medical facility in Landstuhl. The only reason you aren't in Handirons right now is because General Thorne is currently sitting in a SIF with the Secretary of the Army trying to explain why his daughter was found pinned to an MRI machine by a silenced pistol." Elena finally looked at him. Her eyes were bloodshot, the pupils still slightly dilated from the sensory overload, but the gaze was so level, so utterly devoid of the fear Holloway expected, that he actually stepped back. "You're worried about the MRI?" Elena said. "I'm worried about the fact that the Vanguard update is still sitting in the primary server at the TOC. I didn't delete it, Colonel. I just stopped the handshake. If your IT guys try to run a diagnostic, it'll wake back up. And this time it won't just be the 82 ND's data. It'll be every logistics node on the East Coast." Holloway's face went pale, a sickly gray color under the fluorescent lights. "The IT guys, as you call them, are the best the Signal Corps has to offer. They don't need a specialized technician with a history of neurological instability telling them how to do their jobs." He turned on his heel, the Oxford squeaking again. "Stay here. A medical team will be coming to move you to a more secure wing for evaluation. Don't make this harder than it already is, Vance. You've done enough." Elena watched him walk away. She didn't feel the anger she expected. She felt a profound, hollow weight, the kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones. The institution was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was closing ranks. It was protecting the brand. To the Army, she wasn't the woman who had saved the core of their intelligence. She was the glitch that had exposed the vulnerability. She was the witness who made the story too complicated to tell. An hour later, the medical team arrived. They weren't nurses. They were 4 men in civilian tactical gear, not Apex, but the kind of private security the Department of Defense hired when they wanted things done off the books. They didn't speak. They moved with a synchronized efficiency that told Elena everything she needed to know. They placed her in a wheelchair, draped a heavy wool blanket over her torn gown, and began wheeling her through the service elevators, bypassing the main lobby where the media and the MPs were starting to congregate. The personal cost of the night arrived in the silence of the basement corridors. As they pushed her past the morgue and toward the loading docks, Elena felt the absence of the signals. The thick concrete walls and the lead shielding of the radiology department began to dampen the world. For the first time in 16 years, the gray space was quiet. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a limb had been amputated. She reached out with her mind, trying to find the hum of a radio, the pulse of a cell tower, anything to ground her, but there was only the cold, dead weight of the earth. She felt her heart rate spike, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She was a ghost who had lost her haunting grounds. They loaded her into the back of an unmarked black van. Inside, sitting on a bench with a laptop open on his knees, was a man she recognized from the TOC. It wasn't Rodriguez. It wasn't Huck. It was Major Sterling, the intelligence officer who had spent the entire night telling General Thorne that Elena was a security risk. He didn't look at her when she was pushed inside. He waited until the doors were locked and the van began to move, the vibration of the tires on the asphalt a dull, thudding rhythm that Elena felt in her tailbone. "We found your mother's farm," Sterling said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Bluefield, Montana, it's a nice property, a bit isolated. The local power cooperative has been having some trouble with their automated grid lately, unexplained surges, a few house fires. It's a shame when the infrastructure fails like that." Elena's hands tightened on the wool blanket, the gauze over her burns turning pink as the wounds reopened. "The man on the radio," she whispered. "The one Aris was talking to, who is he?" Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were cold, professional, and entirely empty of empathy. "There is no man on the radio, Master Sergeant. There is no Aris Thorne in our custody. There is only a series of unfortunate technical errors and a soldier who has suffered a severe psychological break due to her previous combat injuries. That is the reality. That is the only reality that will ever exist on paper." He turned the laptop around. On the screen was a draft of a 15-6 investigation report. It listed Elena Vance as the primary suspect in an act of domestic sabotage. It detailed her history of sensory processing disorder as evidence of a deteriorating mental state. It suggested that she had hallucinated the apex threat to justify her own intrusion into the TOC. "The general is being retired," Sterling continued, his voice as clinical as a surgeon's. "Effective immediately. For medical reasons, his daughter, Aris, has been moved to a private facility for her own protection. The data you think you saved, it's being purged, all of it. We can't trust the integrity of the servers now that you've touched them. You didn't save the Roman 18 Corps, Vance, you murdered it." The weight of the words hit Elena harder than the blast in Jalalabad. She had given everything, her health, her career, her safety, to protect a mission that the mission itself was now disowning. The institution wasn't just protecting itself, it was erasing the very reason for its existence. "What about Rodriguez?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about the boy in the ICU?" "Specialist Miller will receive a medical discharge," Sterling said. "He won't remember much of the night. The medications they're giving him for his cardiac event are quite effective at clouding the memory. And Sergeant Rodriguez. Well, Rodriguez is a ranger. He knows how to follow orders. He's already been reassigned to a training detachment in Alaska. He won't be talking to anyone." The van slowed down, pulling into a secure parking structure that smelled of damp concrete and exhaust. The doors opened, and the light that spilled in was the harsh, artificial glare of a SIF. A sensitive, compartmented information facility. "You have two choices, Elena," Sterling said, standing up. "You can sign the non-disclosure agreement, accept the medical retirement, and go back to Montana. Your mother's farm will stay on the grid. Your record will be cleared of the AWOL charges. You'll be a ghost, but you'll be a ghost with a pension." He stepped out of the van, then paused, looking back at her. "Or you can keep being the hero. You can tell your story to anyone who will listen. And we will spend every resource of the United States Army proving that you are a broken, delusional woman who tried to burn down her own base because she couldn't handle the noise in her head." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked toward a heavy steel door, leaving the two security guards to haul Elena out of the van. They took her to a small, windowless room. It contained a table, 2 chairs, and a single light fixture that hummed at exactly 60 hertz, a frequency that felt like a drill against Elena's skull. They left her there for hours. She didn't have her boots, she didn't have her radio, she didn't have the gray space. She was just a woman in a torn gown sitting in the dark listening to the sound of her own heart. The door opened at 0900. It wasn't Sterling. It wasn't Holloway. It was Huck. The corporal looked like she had been through a car wreck. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her uniform was wrinkled and stained with mud, and she was clutching a small, battered tablet to her chest like a holy relic. She didn't look at the guards at the door. She walked straight to the table and sat down across from Elena. "They told me I was being reassigned to Fort Huachuca," Huck whispered, her voice barely a breath. "They told me that if I ever spoke your name again, I'd be spending the next 20 years in Leavenworth." Elena looked at her. She saw the fear in the girl's eyes, the way her hands were shaking, but she also saw something else. The same look Rodriguez had given her in the tunnel, the look of a soldier who had seen the truth and couldn't unsee it. "You should go, Huck," Elena said. Go to Huachuca. Forget you ever met me. Huck didn't move. She looked at the door, then leaned across the table, her voice dropping even lower. I didn't delete it, Elena. When they told me to purge the TOC servers, I didn't do it. I ran a mirror instead. I hid the Vanguard code in a dead sector of the base's logistics net. They think it's gone. They think they've cleaned the slate. Elena felt a spark of something in her chest, not hope, but a cold, sharp spark of defiance. Huck, if they find that. They won't, Huck said, a grim smile touching her lips. Because they don't know where to look, but I do, and I know how to access it. I need the key, the one you used to spoof the detonation. Elena looked at the girl. She saw the cost of this moment. Huck was 22 years old. She had a whole career ahead of her, a whole life. If she did this, she was choosing the same path Elena had walked. She was choosing to be a ghost. Why? Elena asked. Because you were right, Huck said, and for the first time her voice was steady. And they are wrong, and because Rodriguez told me to give you this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. She slid it across the table. Elena opened it. It wasn't a message. It was a photograph. A Polaroid, grainy and poorly lit, taken in the back of the ambulance. It showed Rodriguez, his shoulder bandaged, his face pale, but he was holding up a single finger. The #1 sign the Rangers used. And next to him, sitting on the edge of the gurney, was Specialist Miller. The boy was awake. He was looking at the camera with a confused but recognizable expression of life. On the back of the photo, in Rodriguez's jagged, cramped handwriting, were 4 words. Asterisk were still on frequency. Asterisk. Elena felt the weight in her chest shift. The institution had failed. The general had fallen. The mission had been disowned. But the people were still there. The loyalty wasn't to the flag on the wall or the stars on the shoulder. It was to the person standing next to you in the dark. They're coming for the NDA in 10 minutes, Huck whispered. They're going to tell you your mother is in danger. They're going to tell you that you're crazy. Elena looked at the photograph, then at the girl across from her. She felt the 60 hertz hum of the light fixture again, but this time it didn't feel like a drill. It felt like a signal, a pulse, a heartbeat. Give me the tablet, Elena said. Huck slid the device across the table. Elena didn't type. She didn't look for a file. She closed her eyes and pressed her bandaged palm against the glass. She reached out, past the concrete, past the lead shielding, past the sterile silence of the SIF. She looked for the gray space she had thought was lost. It was there, faint and distant, a ghostly shimmer of data moving through the base's old copper wiring. She found the logistics net. She found the dead sector Huck had mentioned. And there, buried under layers of encrypted nonsense, was the Vanguard parasite. It was waiting. It was a beautiful, terrifying weapon, a masterpiece of corporate betrayal. Elena didn't delete it. She didn't activate it. She changed the seed. She took the 440 hertz pulse, the one Aris had used to try and kill Miller, and she wove it into the core of the code. She turned the weapon into a beacon. A silent, invisible signal that would pulse every time a specific Apex-coded device came within 100 yards of a U.S. military installation. She was no longer just protecting the TOC. She was turning the enemy's own tool into a tracking system. It's done, Elena whispered, handing the tablet back. If they try to use it, they'll light up like a flare on every SIGINT screen from here to Maryland. They won't even know they're being watched. Huck took the tablet, her eyes wide. What are you going to do now? Elena stood up as the sound of heavy footsteps approached the door. She smoothed the wool blanket over her gown, her back straight, her head held high. The pain in her hands was a constant, throbbing reminder of what she had lost, but it was also a reminder of what she was. I'm going to sign their paper, Elena said, her voice calm and cold. I'm going to go to Montana. I'm going to be the ghost they want me to be. The door swung open, and Major Sterling stepped inside, followed by 2 men in suits. He was holding a fountain pen and a single sheet of paper. Time's up, Vance, Sterling said, his voice dripping with a false, oily concern. Are we going to be reasonable? Elena looked at him. She didn't see a powerful man. She saw a small, frightened gear in a machine that was already starting to break. She saw a man who thought he could control the wind by closing a window. She picked up the pen. She signed the name they had given her. A name that wasn't hers, a name for a woman who didn't exist. She signed away her career, her medals, her history. She watched as Sterling took the paper, a look of smug relief crossing his face. Good choice, Sterling said. The transport is waiting. We'll have you in Billings by sunset. He turned to leave, but Elena stopped him. Major, she said. He paused, looking back. You told me the system was being replaced. Elena said, her voice a low, dangerous hum that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. You told me I was just an error code. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. For a second, just a second, she let the gray space bleed through. She let him see the woman who had lived in the lightning. She let him feel the 60 hertz pulse of the room synchronize with the cold, hard rhythm of her intent. The thing about error codes, Elena whispered, is that they're the only thing that tells you when the machine is failing, and once you see them, you can never trust the machine again. Sterling's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine unease crossing his face. He didn't answer. He turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Elena was left in the dark for another hour. She didn't mind. She spent the time memorizing the frequency of the lock, the rhythm of the guards breathing, the shape of the silence. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a master sergeant. She was something else. Something the army hadn't invented a rank for yet. They moved her at noon. The trip to the airfield was a blur of tinted windows and high-speed turns. They put her on a small, civilian-marked Gulfstream, a plane that didn't belong to the military but was fueled by its secrets. There were no other passengers. Just Elena and two silent men in suits who sat at the back of the cabin, watching her like she was a bomb that hadn't gone off yet. As the plane climbed into the gray Carolina sky, Elena leaned her head against the window. She felt the vibration of the engines, a powerful, steady roar that she could feel in her teeth. She closed her eyes and reached out. She felt the bass falling away below her. She felt the TOC still humming with the activity of the cleaners. She felt the hospital where Specialist Miller was sleeping a dreamless, medicated sleep. And she felt the beacon she had left behind, a tiny, rhythmic pulse buried in the heart of the Army's logistics. Asterisk thrum, 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 asterisk it was a heartbeat. The personal cost of the night was absolute. She was leaving behind the only life she had ever known. She was going to a place where no one knew her name, where her mother was a target, where the gray space would be her only companion in the long, quiet nights of the Montana winter. She was losing her identity, her purpose, her home. But as the plane leveled off at 30,000 feet, the sun breaking through the clouds to bathe the cabin in a sudden, blinding gold, Elena Vance felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. She reached into the pocket of the tactical jacket, the one thing they had let her keep, perhaps as a final, unintentional mercy. Her fingers brushed against the small, jagged piece of glass she had taken from the server room. It was cold and sharp, a fragment of the reality she had shattered. She held it tight, letting the edge press into the gauze of her palm. She wasn't finished. The voice on the radio was still out there. Aris Thorne was still out there. The future they were building was a world of cold, digital control, a world where people were variables and loyalty was a liability. They thought they had buried her. They thought they had turned her into a ghost. But ghosts have one advantage over the living. They can go anywhere. They can see everything. And they never, ever stop. The flight to Montana took 6 hours. 6 hours of silence, of the hum of the engines, of the slow, steady realization that the world she was returning to was not the world she had left. When the plane finally touched down on the small, private strip outside of Billings, the sun was a dying ember on the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Rockies in shades of violet and bruised orange. The air that hit her when the door opened was cold, crisp, and smelled of pine needles and coming snow. It was a clean smell, a honest smell. The two men in suits escorted her to a waiting SUV. They didn't speak. They didn't offer her a hand. They simply watched as she climbed into the back seat, her bare feet flinching at the cold of the leather. "This is where it ends, Vance," one of the men said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Stay on the farm. Don't use a radio. Don't use a computer. If we see a signal coming from that valley that we don't like, we'll be back." Elena didn't look at him. She looked at the mountains. "I'm already gone," she said. The SUV pulled away, leaving the airfield behind. They drove for 40 minutes, winding through the narrow, snow-dusted roads that led toward the edge of the valley. Elena watched the landscape. She saw the broken fences, the rusted tractors, the small, lonely lights of farmhouses tucked into the folds of the hills. It was a world that felt ancient, a world that didn't care about servers or talks or the Roman 18 Corps. The vehicle stopped at the end of a long, gravel driveway. At the far end, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was a small red barn with a sagging roof and a white farmhouse with a single light burning in the kitchen window. Her mother's house. The driver didn't get out. He just unlocked the doors. "You have 5 minutes to get inside," he said. "After that, the perimeter sensors go live. If you cross the fence line, we'll know." Elena stepped out of the SUV. The gravel was sharp under her feet, the cold of the ground seeping into her skin. She didn't look back at the vehicle as it turned and sped away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. She stood there for a long time, the silence of the valley wrapping around her like a shroud. There were no signals here, no cell towers, no high-speed nets, just the wind in the pines and the distant, rhythmic asterisk, crick, crick, crick asterisk of a cricket. She walked toward the house, her footsteps heavy in the gravel. Every step was a cost. Every step was a piece of the woman she used to be falling away into the dark. She reached the porch and stopped. She looked at her hands. The white gauze was gray now, stained with the dust of the road and the residue of the night. She looked at the torn hospital gown, the tactical jacket that was 3 sizes too big. She looked like a survivor. She looked like a wreck. She reached out and touched the doorknob. It was cold iron, solid and real, but as her fingers closed around the metal, she felt it. A faint, rhythmic vibration. A pulse. It wasn't a signal from the house. It wasn't a signal from the valley. It was coming from the barn. Elena froze, her heart rate spiked, her breath hitching in her throat. She closed her eyes and reached into the gray space, pushing past the exhaustion, past the pain, past the silence of the earth. She found it. A localized, high-frequency burst, encrypted, short-range. It was a handshake. Someone was in the barn. Someone with a high-bandwidth satellite link. Someone who was waiting for her. Elena didn't go into the house. She didn't call out for her mother. She turned and began to walk toward the barn, her bare feet silent on the cold, damp grass. The barn smelled of old hay, dry rot, and something else, something sharp and metallic. The smell of a clean room. She pushed the heavy wooden door open. It didn't creak. The hinges had been recently oiled. Inside, the barn was a cavern of shadows, the only light coming from a single blue LED flickering on a portable server rack tucked into the corner of a horse stall. Sitting on a hay bale in front of the rack was a man. He was wearing a dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his face a mask of calm, corporate competence. He was holding a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with a map of the United States, a map covered in tiny, pulsing red dots. He looked up as Elena entered. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who was welcoming an old friend. "Master Sergeant Vance," the man said. His voice was the one from the radio, the smooth, cultured voice that sounded like it belonged in a boardroom. "You're right on time. I was starting to worry the army had decided to keep you after all." Elena didn't move. She stood in the doorway, the cold wind of the valley blowing past her into the barn. She looked at the server rack, at the blue LED, at the map of red dots. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous rasp. The man smiled. It was a small, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the future, Elena," he said, "and I'm here to offer you a job." He stood up, the tablet in his hand flickering as a new signal hit the net. "The army thinks they've buried you," he continued, walking toward her. "They think they've turned you into a ghost, but they don't understand what a ghost can actually do. They don't understand the power of a woman who doesn't exist." He stopped 3 feet away, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in his eyes. "You saved the TOC data, Elena. You think you protected the mission. But do you know what was actually in those files? Do you know what the Roman 18 Corps was actually working on?" Elena didn't answer. She felt the signal coming from the tablet, a high-orbit satellite bounce. This wasn't a local link. This was global. "It wasn't about undercover identities," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It wasn't about logistics. It was about us. It was about the network we've spent 20 years building inside your military. The Vanguard update wasn't a hack, Elena. It was a transition." He held the tablet out to her. "Take a look," he said. "See what you actually saved." Elena didn't reach for the tablet. She reached into the gray space, letting the signal from the device flood her mind. She saw the data. She saw the map. The red dots weren't military bases. They weren't targets. They were people. Thousands of them. Soldiers, officers, contractors, analysts. Every single one of them was marked with a specific encrypted code. A Vanguard code. The corporate coup hadn't failed. It hadn't even been delayed. The TOC battle had been a diversion, a distraction. A way to get the army to focus on the servers while the real update was being moved into the people themselves. The gray space wasn't a glitch in Elena's brain, it was a prototype. "You're the first, Elena," the man said, his voice a soft, rhythmic thrum. "The first to successfully integrate the signal, the first to see the world as it actually is, and we need you. We need you to lead the others." Elena felt the world tilt. She looked at her hands, the gauze, the burns, the red clay. She looked at the barn, the farmhouse, the valley. Everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed. It had all been a lie. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a ghost. She was a beta test. The man stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Come with us, Elena," he said. Leave the ghost behind, become the god you were meant to be. Elena looked at his hand. She felt the signal coming from his watch, a high-frequency pulse that was perfectly synchronized with the heartbeat of the room. She looked at the man's face. She saw the emptiness there, the cold, digital hunger of a machine that wanted to eat the world. She didn't take his hand. She reached into the pocket of the tactical jacket and pulled out the small, jagged piece of glass. She didn't use it as a weapon. She held it up to the light of the tablet, the sharp edges reflecting the blue glow back into the man's eyes. "I'm not a god," Elena whispered, her voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. "And I'm not your prototype." She closed her eyes and reached out, not for the gray space, not for the network, not for the signal. She reached for the beacon, the one she had hidden in the heart of the Army's logistics, the one that was currently pulsing in every apex-coded device on the planet. She didn't activate it. She changed the frequency. She took the 440 Hz pulse, the one that had almost killed Miller, and she wove it into the core of the man's tablet. The device exploded, not a physical explosion, a digital one, a sudden violent surge of data that ripped through the satellite link, through the server rack, through the man's own encrypted comm link. The man screamed, clutching his ears as the 140-decibel feedback loop erupted from his headset. He fell to his knees, the tablet shattered on the floor, the blue LED of the server rack flickering out into darkness. Elena didn't wait to see if he was dead. She turned and walked out of the barn, her footsteps silent on the cold, damp grass. She walked past the house. She walked past the white farmhouse where the light was still burning in the kitchen window. She walked past the broken fence and the rusted tractor. She walked toward the mountains. The institution had failed. The mission was a lie. The future was a war, but Elena Vance was no longer invisible. She was the ghost in the machine, and she was coming for them all. She reached the edge of the woods, the shadows of the pines swallowing her whole. She didn't look back. She didn't look at the lights of the valley. She looked ahead at the dark, jagged peaks of the Rockies where the real war was waiting. The personal cost was total. She had nothing left. No name, no home, no life. But as she stepped into the darkness, the cold wind of the mountains biting into her skin, Elena Vance felt the gray space settle around her like a suit of armor. She was on frequency, and for the first time in her life, she was the one who was holding the signal. The silence of the mountains was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the future, and Elena Vance was ready for it. She disappeared into the trees, a shadow moving through the dark, a ghost who had finally found her purpose. The reckoning was coming, and she would be the one to deliver it. Part 4 ends here. The resolution is for Part 5. The snow started falling in Billings at 22:14, a dry, crystalline powder that didn't just cover the red clay on Elena Vance's feet, but seemed to seek out the heat still radiating from the chemical burns on her palms. She didn't feel the cold as a threat. She felt it as a baseline, a thermal reset for a nervous system that had been overclocked since the first alarm went off at Fort Liberty. Her boots were gone, left behind in a sterile room she was never supposed to leave, and the gravel of the trailhead bit into her arches with a rhythmic, grounding pain. She walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had humped 60-pound rucks through the Hindu Kush, her shoulders squared despite the thin hospital gown beneath her oversized tactical jacket. Behind her, the barn was a dark shape against the violet sky, the man in the suit likely still clawing at the air, his brain trying to process the digital shrapnel she had fired through his uplink. She didn't head for the farmhouse yet. She headed for the ridge. The gray space was different here in the high desert of Montana. In North Carolina, the air had been thick with the humidity of 1,000 overlapping signals, cell towers, encrypted military nets, the low-frequency hum of a sprawling power grid. Here, the spectrum was wide and terrifyingly empty. It felt like standing in a cathedral after living in a subway station. She could see the distant pulse of a weather station 50 miles to the north, a slow, lonely heartbeat in the dark. She could feel the static electricity building in the clouds, a shimmering curtain of potential energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. There was no one to hide behind here, no noise to drown in. If they came for her, she would see them coming from the horizon, but they would see her just as clearly. She reached the summit of the first ridge and turned back. The farmhouse looked small, a single yellow eye burning in the kitchen window. That light was her mother, Martha Vance, a woman who had buried a husband and a son and had spent the last 20 years pretending her daughter was a regular communications officer who just happened to never talk about her work. Elena stood there, her breath blooming in the air like white smoke, and let the silence of the valley settle into her bones. She reached out one last time, not for the enemy, but for the beacon. Asterisk thrum. Thrum, thrum, asterisk, it was still there. Buried in the logistics net of the Roman 18 Airborne Corps, the code she had modified was singing its silent song. It wasn't an attack, it was a tether. As long as that signal lived, anyone using the Apex-coded software would be leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. She had turned their weapon into a tracking collar. She had lost her career, her rank, and her identity, but she had left a permanent scar on the machine that had tried to consume her. It was a quiet victory, the kind that didn't come with a ribbon or a ceremony, but as the wind howled through the pines, Elena felt a sharp, cold sense of satisfaction. She was an error code that the system could no longer ignore. She descended the ridge as the snow began to accumulate, turning the world into a study in gray and white. By the time she reached the porch of the farmhouse, her feet were numb and her hands were shaking, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue. She didn't knock. She reached up and found the spare key hidden inside the cast-iron dinner bell, the metal freezing against her skin. The kitchen smelled of Murphy oil soap and stale coffee. Martha Vance was sitting at the wooden table, a half-knitted sweater in her lap and a shotgun leaning against the refrigerator. She didn't jump when the door opened. She didn't scream. She simply looked at her daughter, at the torn gown, the bandaged hands, the blood-stained feet, and stood up. "I heard the barn door," Martha said, her voice as steady as the mountains. "And I felt the power flicker. I figured you were either home or the world was ending." "Both," Elena said, her voice cracking. Martha didn't ask questions. She didn't ask why the army hadn't called or why Elena looked like she had been dragged through a war zone. She walked over, draped a heavy wool blanket over Elena's shoulders, and guided her toward the stove. This was the family dynamic of the Vances. They didn't perform their pain. They managed it. Martha moved with an efficient, practiced grace, filling a basin with warm water and retrieving a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in a field hospital. As Martha knelt to clean the red clay and snow from Elena's feet, the silence in the kitchen wasn't heavy. It was a buffer. Elena watched her mother's hands, rough, calloused, and infinitely gentle. She realized then that she hadn't just inherited her father's height or her brother's stubbornness. She had inherited this, the ability to stay controlled when the world was falling apart. "They're going to come here, Ma," Elena whispered, the warmth of the water sending a stinging jolt through her toes. "They already have," Martha said, not looking up. "A man in a suit came by 3 days ago, said he was from the Veterans Administration. Asked if I'd heard from you. I told him I hadn't heard from you since you were a corporal and forgot my birthday. He didn't believe me, but he didn't like the look of the dog, so he didn't stay long." Elena felt a surge of protective fear. "You can't stay here if they find out what I did." "This is my dirt, Elena," Martha interrupted, her eyes snapping up, fierce and bright under the fluorescent kitchen light. "Your father is in the ground 2 miles from here. Your brother's name is on the wall at the high school. I'm not moving for some man in a suit. Not for the army and not for whatever it is you brought home with you." She patted Elena's knee and stood up, moving to the cupboards. "You're going to eat, then you're going to sleep in your old bed, and tomorrow we're going to fix that barn door." Elena ate the stew her mother placed in front of her without tasting it. She watched the way the light from the refrigerator hummed, a steady 60 hertz vibration that she usually found irritating but now felt like a lullaby. She was back in the world of physical things. Wood, iron, stew, wool. The gray space was still there, a shimmering ghost at the edge of her vision, but for the first time in years she didn't feel like she had to fight it. She was home. She slept for 14 hours. It wasn't the light, tactical sleep of a soldier in a forward operating base. It was a heavy, suffocating darkness, the kind that only comes when the body finally gives up the ghost of its own survival. She dreamed of the MRI machine, of the blue light and the 440 hertz pulse, but in the dream, the boy specialist Miller wasn't screaming. He was laughing. He was standing in a field of Montana wheat, his heart beating a steady, healthy rhythm that she could feel in her own chest. When she woke, the room was filled with the harsh, bright light of a Montana morning. The snow had stopped, leaving a world so white it hurt to look at. Elena sat up, the sheets rasping against the bandages on her hands. She felt the weight of her choice. She had signed the NDA. She had accepted the medical retirement. On paper, she was a broken woman, a casualty of a war that didn't exist. She had no rank, no authority, no weapon. She got out of bed and dressed in her old clothes, flannel, heavy denim work boots that felt like anchors. She walked downstairs to find the kitchen empty, a note from her mother saying she was out checking the fences. Elena stepped out onto the porch, the air so cold it turned the moisture in her nose to ice instantly. A black SUV was parked at the end of the driveway. It wasn't the unmarked van from the hospital. It was an army vehicle. It had the government plates, the subtle antenna array on the roof, and the clean, polished look of a staff car from a major command. Elena didn't run. She didn't reach for a weapon. She walked down the steps and stood in the gravel, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets. She watched the driver's side door open. A man stepped out. He was in class A uniforms, the green wool crisp, the brass on his shoulders gleaming in the winter sun. He was a colonel, his chest a row of ribbons that told a story of 30 years of service. He looked like the kind of man who had spent his life believing in the institution, the kind of man Elena had once hoped to become. He didn't walk toward her with the aggression of the security team. He walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, his cap pulled low against the glare of the snow. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her, really looked at her. "Master Sergeant Vance," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and carried the cadence of the South. "I'm a civilian, sir," Elena said, her voice flat. "I signed the papers." The colonel looked at the farmhouse, then back at her. "I know what you signed. I also know what Major Sterling put in your file. I've spent the last 48 hours reading every scrap of data that came out of Hangar 7. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. He didn't offer it to her. He just held it in his palm, the light catching the purple ribbon and the gold profile of George Washington. "They told me to give you this," he said. "The official record says you were injured in a training accident involving a localized power surge. They're calling it a heroic effort to stabilize equipment." Elena looked at the Purple Heart. It felt like a toy, a plastic trinket offered in exchange for her soul. "Keep it, Colonel. I didn't do it for the medal." The colonel nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. He tucked the box back into his pocket. "I didn't think you would. I'm not here to buy your silence, Vance. I'm here because Sergeant Rodriguez wouldn't stop screaming at my adjutant until I agreed to drive out here myself." Elena's heart skipped. "Rodriguez? Is he okay?" "He's a ranger," the colonel said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He's currently being processed for a reassignment he didn't ask for, but he wanted you to have this." He reached into the SUV and pulled out a small, heavy Pelican case. He walked forward and set it on the hood of the vehicle. "There was a clerical error in the inventory of your personal effects," the colonel said, stepping back. "Some equipment was listed as destroyed that. Well, it appears it wasn't. Since you're no longer active duty, it's technically surplus. Consider it a gift from the 82nd. He straightened his cap and offered a sharp, crisp salute. It wasn't the salute of a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of one soldier acknowledging another on a battlefield that no one else could see. "Good luck, Elena," he said. He got back into the SUV and backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the frozen gravel. Elena watched until the vehicle was a black speck on the horizon, then she walked to the Pelican case. She popped the latches. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was her tablet, the one from the TOC. But it wasn't just the hardware. Taped to the screen was a small, handwritten note from Huck. "Asterisk, the frequency is still open. We found the man in the barn. He won't be bothering you again. Stay loud, Ghost." Asterisk underneath the tablet was her old unit patch, the All-American Ah. It was scorched at the edges, the embroidery frayed. Elena picked up the tablet. She didn't turn it on. She didn't need to. As soon as her fingers touched the casing, she felt it. The gray space surged, but it wasn't the chaotic, painful roar of the hospital. It was a focused, rhythmic pulse. Huck hadn't just returned her hardware, she had linked it to a secure off-the-books relay. She wasn't alone. Rodriguez was out there. Huck was out there. Even the boy Miller was out there. They were the nodes in a new network. A network that didn't answer to General Thorne or Major Sterling or the Apex Corporation. A network of people who had looked into the dark and decided to carry a light. The cost had been her life as she knew it. She had lost the uniform, the rank, the structure of the army. She had lost the security of a pension and the clarity of an objective. But as she stood in the Montana snow, Elena realized she had gained something far more dangerous. She had gained freedom. She walked back to the house, the tablet tucked under her arm. Her mother was coming up the path from the lower pasture, her face red from the wind, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She saw Elena and slowed down, her eyes moving to the Pelican case on the hood. "More trouble?" Martha asked, stopping at the porch. "No," Elena said, looking at the tablet. Just work. Martha looked at her daughter for a long, quiet moment. She saw the change in Elena's eyes, the way the 1,000-yard stare had been replaced by something sharper, something more intentional. She saw the way Elena held the tablet not as a tool, but as a weapon. "I reckon the barn door can wait another day," Martha said, turning to head into the house. "Coffee's still hot." Elena didn't follow her immediately. She sat on the porch swing, the wood creaking under her weight. She watched the sun move across the valley, the shadows of the mountains stretching out like long, dark fingers. She felt the world humming around her. She reached out with her mind, moving past the local signals, past the weather station and the sheriff's radio. She looked for the beacon. It was still there. Asterisk thrum. Thrum. Thrum, asterisk, but there was something else now. Faint, distant, and perfectly synchronized, she felt 3 other pulses. One from a training camp in Alaska, one from a signal center in Arizona, one from a hospital bed in North Carolina. They were answering her. The gray space wasn't a prison anymore. It was a map. A week later, the first snow of December arrived in earnest. It was a whiteout storm, the kind that turned the valley into a void where the sky and the earth merged into a single, blinding wall of white. The power went out at 1600, the lines humming and then snapping under the weight of the ice. Martha Vance grumbled about the old cooperative and started lighting the kerosene lamps. She moved through the house with the practiced ease of a woman who had lived through 50 Montana winters, her shadow dancing on the walls in the amber light. Elena was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with the tablet open. She wasn't using the house's power. She was running on the internal battery, the screen the only source of blue light in the room. She was watching a signal. A small, rhythmic pulse coming from a private airfield in Denver. It was a Vanguard handshake. A high-level executive from Apex was moving, thinking he was invisible, thinking he was protected by the silence of the storm. Elena didn't attack him. She didn't trigger a surge. She just watched. She logged the coordinates. She mapped the connections. She was building a ledger of every ghost in the machine. "You're going to ruin your eyes," Martha said, setting a lamp down on the table. She looked at the screen, at the complex web of data and light. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. She saw the way her daughter's fingers moved over the glass, the same way her husband's fingers had moved over the grain of a piece of oak, or the way her son's fingers had moved over the trigger of a rifle. It was the family trade. "I'm just keeping an eye on things, Ma," Elena said. Martha sat down across from her, the light from the lamp carving deep lines in her face. "You know, when you were 5, you used to sit out on the porch and tell me you could hear the stars. I thought you were just a dreamer. I thought you were like your father, always looking for something that wasn't there." Elena looked up, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her pupils. "I wasn't dreaming, Ma." "I know that now," Martha said, her voice soft. "I think I always knew. I just wanted you to have a normal life. I wanted you to be able to walk through a room and not feel the world pressing in on you." She reached across the table and touched Elena's hand, the one with the scarred palm. "But the world is a noisy place, Elena, and some people are just built to hear it." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at her mother, at the woman who had protected her in the only way she knew how, by giving her a place where the noise couldn't reach. "I'm sorry I brought it home," Elena whispered. "Don't be," Martha said, standing up to go check the wood stove. "The noise was already here. You're just the one who knows how to turn it down." Elena went back to the screen. She felt the weight of the house around her, the solid, honest warmth of the wood, the smell of the kerosene, the sound of the wind howling against the siding. It was a sanctuary, but it wasn't a hiding place. It was a base of operations. She spent the night monitoring the signals. She watched the Apex executive land in Denver. She watched the data transfer to a server in Virginia. She watched the cleaners try to purge the last remnants of the Vanguard code from the Fort Liberty servers, and she watched them fail. The beacon was too deep. It was part of the architecture now. At 0300, a message blinked on the screen. It was encrypted, routed through a dozen different proxies, but the signature was unmistakable. Asterisk Miller is walking. Rodriguez is at the gate. We're waiting for the word. Asterisk Elena looked at the message for a long time. She felt the gray space vibrate, a low, steady hum of potential. She could give the word. She could trigger the surge. She could burn the network down from the inside out, but she didn't. Not yet. A hunter doesn't fire as soon as they see the prey. They wait. They watch. They wait for the moment when the wind is right and the target is clear. She typed a single word in response, asterisk watch. Asterisk she closed the tablet and sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe. She felt the silence of the Montana night, the vast, empty space between the stars. She wasn't a soldier in a uniform anymore. She wasn't a master sergeant with a paycheck and a mission statement. She was a woman in a kitchen in Montana. She was a daughter. She was a ghost. And she was the most dangerous thing the Apex Corporation had ever created. The winter deepened. The valley became a world of ice and shadow, the sun a pale, distant ghost that barely cleared the ridges. Elena spent her days working the farm. She fixed the barn door. She cleared the snow from the roof. She helped her mother move the hay for the horses. Her hands healed. The thick white gauze was replaced by thin strips of medical tape, then by nothing at all. The scars were there, pale, jagged reminders of the 440 hertz pulse, but the skin was tough. She could feel the world again. She found a rhythm in the physical labor. The weight of the hay bales, the bite of the axe, the steady, rhythmic pull of the shovel. It was a different kind of signal, a manual frequency. It grounded her in a way the military never had. But every night when the house was quiet and the lamps were low, she went back to the gray space. She was no longer just watching. She was building. Using the link Huck had provided, she began to reach out to other ghosts. Other soldiers who had been sidelined, other technicians who had seen too much, other analysts who had been told to look the other way. She didn't ask them for loyalty. She didn't ask them for secrets. She just asked them to listen. She taught them how to find the gray space. She taught them how to see the patterns in the noise. She was building a network of people who could hear the stars. One evening in late January, the telephone in the hallway rang. It was an old rotary dial phone, a heavy black relic that usually only rang when the local feed store had a delivery. Martha answered it, her voice a low murmur in the hall. She came back into the kitchen, her expression unreadable. "It's for you," she said. "A woman said she was an old friend from North Carolina." Elena walked to the hall and picked up the receiver. The plastic was cold against her ear. "Vance," she said. "It's Huck," the voice whispered. The signal was clean, encrypted through a civilian satellite link. "I'm in Huachuca. They moved me to the signal school. I'm teaching advanced electronic warfare to a bunch of kids who can't even find their own reflections." Elena smiled. "Sounds like a promotion, Huck." "It's a cage, Elena," Huck said, and for a second the bravado slipped. "They're watching me every keystroke, every phone call. I'm only talking to you because I'm using an old analog line that isn't on the grid." "What happened?" Elena asked, her voice dropping. "They're moving the Vanguard update to the civilian sector," Huck said. "They're calling it Project Sentinel. It's going to be integrated into the national power grid, the banking systems, the emergency response nets. They're launching it in 48 hours. Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "The general?" "Thorne is the CEO of the new consortium," Huck said. "He retired with 4 stars and a golden parachute. And Aris is the lead architect. They're not even hiding it anymore, Elena. They're just calling it public-private partnership." The betrayal was complete. The institution hadn't just failed to stop the coup, it had handed over the keys to the kingdom. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked. "I can't reach the core," Huck said, her voice trembling. "They've isolated the servers. But you're already in the architecture, the beacon. If you can trigger it from your end, you can bridge the gap. You can let us in." Elena looked at the wall, at the framed photograph of her father in his dress blues. She thought about the mission. She thought about the oath she had taken when she was 18 years old, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The enemy wasn't in a cave in Afghanistan. The enemy was in a boardroom in Virginia. "I'll be ready," Elena said. "Wait," Huck said. "Elena, if you do this, they'll know exactly where you are. They'll see the origin point. They'll come for the farm." "I know," Elena said. "Is it worth it?" Huck asked. Elena looked through the doorway into the kitchen. She saw her mother sitting by the stove, her eyes closed, her hands resting in her lap. She saw the life they had built in the silence. "The noise is coming, Huck," Elena said. "I can't let it reach the stars." She hung up the phone and walked back into the kitchen. She didn't say anything. She just sat down at the table and opened the tablet. She began the sequence. It was a beautiful piece of code, a digital symphony. She didn't just activate the beacon, she wove it into a feedback loop that would resonate through every Apex-coded device on the planet. It wouldn't destroy them. It wouldn't crash the systems. It would just make them loud. Every secret communication, every encrypted file, every hidden command, it would all be broadcast on an open frequency. The gray space would be open for everyone to see. She worked through the night, her fingers flying over the glass. She felt the gray space expanding, a glowing web of light that stretched from her kitchen in Montana to the farthest reaches of the globe. She felt the power of the network, the sheer, terrifying scale of what they had built, and she felt the moment when they noticed her. A sudden, violent surge of data hit her link. It was a counterattack, a digital strike designed to fry her hardware and her brain. Elena didn't flinch. She leaned into the surge. She used the gray space to ground the energy, shunting it into the house's old copper wiring. The lights in the kitchen flared bright white and then popped, showering the room in glass and darkness. "Elena!" Martha shouted, standing up. "Stay back, Ma!" Elena yelled, her eyes fixed on the screen. The tablet was glowing red-hot, the casing starting to smoke. Elena's hands were shaking, the scars on her palms throbbing with a phantom heat. She felt the enemy clawing at her mind, trying to find the prototype, trying to reclaim the ghost. She pushed back. She didn't use her rank. She didn't use her authority. She used her capability. She found the core of the Project Sentinel server. She found the heartbeat of the Vanguard code. And then she gave it the frequency, 440 hertz. The digital world screamed. Across the planet, in data centers and boardrooms and military installations, screens went white. Encrypted files dissolved into raw, unreadable data. Secure links became open channels. The shadows were burned away by a sudden, blinding light of transparency. The coup was over. The Project Sentinel didn't crash, it just became visible, and in that visibility it died. The tablet in Elena's hands gave one final, violent pulse and then went dark. The screen cracked, a spiderweb of black lines across the blue glow. Elena sat in the dark kitchen, the smell of ozone and burnt plastic thick in the air. Her hands were raw, the skin red and blistered, but she didn't feel the pain. She felt the silence. The gray space was gone, not the capability. She could still feel the world humming, but the noise. The parasite was dead. The Vanguard code had been purged. She was just Elena Vance. "It's done," she whispered. Martha was standing in the doorway, a kerosene lamp in her hand. She looked at the shattered tablet, at the glass on the floor, at her daughter's burnt hands. She didn't ask what had happened. She saw the look on Elena's face, the look of a woman who had finally finished the mission. "You're going to need more bandages," Martha said. They spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, the lamplight flickering in the draft. Martha cleaned Elena's hands again, her touch as gentle as it had been on the first night. They didn't talk about the code or the general or the future. They talked about the spring. They talked about the horses and the fences and the way the valley looked when the wildflowers first started to bloom. At dawn, a single black SUV pulled into the driveway. Elena didn't get up. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped in clean white gauze, and watched the vehicle stop. A man got out. He wasn't in a suit. He wasn't in a uniform. He was wearing an old army field jacket and a pair of faded jeans. He was carrying a small brown paper bag. It was Rodriguez. He walked up the steps and into the house without knocking. He looked tired. He had a new scar on his temple and his left arm was in a sling, but his eyes were bright and he was smiling. He walked over to the table and set the bag down in front of Elena. "What's this?" she asked. "Coffee," he said. "The good stuff. From that place in Fayetteville you used to like. I figured you were probably running low on anything that didn't taste like dirt." He looked at Martha and nodded respectfully. "Ma'am." "Sergeant," Martha said, offering him a seat. Rodriguez sat down and looked at Elena's bandaged hands. "Huck called me. She said the signals are all over the news. Thorne is being detained for questioning. The whole Project Sentinel thing is being dismantled by a congressional subcommittee. They're calling it the Vance anomaly." Elena leaned back in her chair. "The Vance anomaly, I like that." "The army is still looking for you," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping. "Not the bad guys, the real army. They want to give you back your rank. They want to put you in charge of a new signals intelligence command at Fort Meade." Elena looked at her hands. She thought about the sterile rooms, the fluorescent lights, the hierarchy of liability. She thought about the noise. "I'm retired, Sergeant," she said. Rodriguez nodded. "I told them you'd say that, but they're going to keep asking. You're a hero, Elena, whether you like it or not." "I'm not a hero," Elena said. "I'm just a ghost." Rodriguez reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal. It was a coin, a challenge coin, the kind soldiers give to each other to mark a shared trial. It was blank on one side, and on the other it had a single engraved frequency, 440. He slid it across the table. "The guys from the TOC sent this," he said. "Miller, Huck, and the others, we're all being reassigned, but we're staying on the frequency. If you ever need anything, if the noise gets too loud, you just let us know." Elena picked up the coin. It was cold and heavy, a physical anchor for the digital world she had left behind. "Thanks, Rodriguez," she said. He stayed for breakfast, then he got back into his SUV and drove away. Elena watched him go, then she walked out onto the porch. The sun was finally clearing the ridge, the light turning the snow into a field of diamonds. The air was still cold, but the wind had died down. It was a quiet morning. She stood there for a long time, the coin held tight in her bandaged hand. She felt the world humming around her, the distant pulse of a plane, the low-frequency vibration of the earth, the slow, steady heartbeat of the mountains. She wasn't a master sergeant. She wasn't a prototype. She was a woman on a porch in Montana. She reached out with her mind one last time, not for the enemy, not for the beacon. She reached for the silence. And she found it. Deep beneath the noise, beneath the signals and the data and the chaos of the world, there was a place where the stars were still singing. Elena Vance closed her eyes and listened. She was home. The snow began to fall again, a soft, gentle powder that covered the tracks in the driveway and the scars on the barn door. It covered the farmhouse and the valley and the mountains, turning the world into a single, clean sheet of white. Inside the house, Martha was humming a song Elena didn't recognize, the sound of the wood stove, a steady, comforting rhythm in the background. Elena sat on the porch swing and watched the world disappear into the white. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the fear. She just felt the frequency. It was a beautiful, honest sound, and it was the only thing she needed to hear. The signal was clear.